Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on one of cinema's most beloved mob bosses, Paul Vario, the real man behind Paulie Cicero and Goodfellas. But what if I told you that the calm, fatherly figure you saw on screen was a lie? Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this underworld family grow across borders and time zones. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because here at Outlaw Icons, we don't just retell the stories. We reveal the truth they buried. Now, take a deep breath, let the glow of the screen fade. Forget the Hollywood version. And prepare to meet the real Paul Vario, a violent, dangerous career criminal whose reign of terror the movies erased. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Brooklyn's Forgotten Son, 1914 to 1937. He was 11 years old the first time the state decided he was dangerous. Not for stealing, not for fighting, not even for the kind of petty crime that filled the Brooklyn streets in 1925. No, Paul Vario was locked away for 7 months because he refused to go to school. Truancy, they called it. A fancy word for a boy who had already learned that survival wasn't taught in classrooms. 7 months in juvenile detention. 7 months to watch, to learn, to harden. 7 months to understand that the world was divided into two kinds of people. Those who follow the rules, and those who made them. He came out different. But to understand how a boy becomes a monster, you have to go back further. Back to July 9th, 1914, when Paul Frank Vario was born into a New York City that was already choking on its own ambition. The Great War was just beginning across the ocean. Immigrants packed into tenements like sardines in a can. And in the Old Mill district of South Brooklyn, the Vario family was adding one more mouth to feed. His parents were Italian immigrants, part of that great wave of humanity that fled poverty in the old country, only to find a different kind of poverty in the new one. They settled in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Brooklyn, where the streets smelled like salt water and rotting fish, where men worked the docks until their backs broke, where mothers hung laundry from fire escapes and prayed their children would make it home alive. The Old Mill District wasn't just poor, it was forgotten. A maze of narrow streets and crumbling brownstones where legitimate opportunity was as rare as fresh air. The police didn't patrol there unless they had to. City officials didn't visit unless there was an election. It was a place where normal rules didn't quite apply, where a different kind of law took hold. And young Paul Vario was watching. Always watching. By the time he could walk, he knew which corners belonged to which crews. He knew which men commanded respect, and which ones got their heads kicked in. He knew that money meant power, and power meant survival, and the men with both never seemed to work at the docks. They wore nice suits. They had soft hands. They moved through the neighborhood like sharks through water, and everyone got out of their way. School must have seemed like a joke to him. What was some teacher going to tell him about the world that he hadn't already learned in the streets? What was algebra going to do for a kid who was already calculating the odds of making it to 15? So he stopped going. Just stopped. And when the truancy officers came knocking, when they dragged him in front of a judge, he probably didn't even fight it. Why would he? He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Juvenile detention in the 1920s wasn't rehabilitation. It was a finishing school for criminals. A place where petty thieves met future murderers, where small-time hustlers networked with budding racketeers. The state thought they were punishing these boys. What they were actually doing was building a criminal farm system, a minor league for the mob. Paul Vario spent 7 months learning from the best teachers a future gangster could ask for. Boys who had actually done the things he'd only dreamed about. Boys who had connections, who knew people, who understood how the underworld really worked. He was 11 years old, and he was getting his real education. When he walked out of that facility, he wasn't the same kid who went in. Something had shifted. Something had hardened. The streets of Brooklyn welcomed him back, but now he saw them differently. Not as a maze, but as a map. Not as a prison, but as a kingdom waiting to be claimed. The 1920s were roaring in Manhattan, but in South Brooklyn, they were snarling. Prohibition had turned organized crime from a local nuisance into a national industry. Every speakeasy needed booze. Every bootlegger needed protection. Every protection racket needed muscle. And there were opportunities everywhere for a kid with nothing to lose. Paul was growing now, shooting up fast, and he was learning that violence was a language everyone understood. Not wild violence, not the kind of random brutality that got you killed. Calculated violence, purposeful violence, the kind that made people remember you, that made them think twice before crossing you. He started running errands for local wise guys. Small stuff at first, delivering packages, passing messages, standing lookout. The kind of work that kept a teenager fed and taught him the rhythms of the rackets. He was building a reputation, making connections, proving he could keep his mouth shut. That last part was crucial. In a world where talking to the cops could get you killed, silence was the most valuable currency. And Paul Vario was learning to speak in silence, to communicate through glances and gestures, to understand what wasn't being said. The Depression hit in '29, and whatever legitimate opportunities might have existed evaporated like steam off the Brooklyn docks. Men who'd worked honest jobs their whole lives were suddenly standing in bread lines. Families were evicted. Children went hungry. But the mob never missed a meal. If anything, hard times were good for business. Desperate people made desperate choices. They borrowed money they couldn't pay back. They got involved in schemes they should have avoided. They turned to the same men who'd been running the neighborhood all along. The men who always seemed to have cash when everyone else had nothing. Paul was 17 now, 18, 19. No longer a boy, not quite a man, but something in between. Something dangerous. He'd been arrested a few times for petty stuff, nothing that stuck. Each time he walked away a little smarter, a little more careful. He was learning the art of not getting caught. His family watched him drift further into that world. But what could they do? The legitimate world had nothing to offer him. No factory job was going to pay what he could make in a week running numbers. No honest work was going to command the respect he got walking down the street. By the time he was in his 20s, Paul Vario wasn't just another street punk. He was becoming someone, making real money, building real connections, getting noticed by the right people, the kind of people who could open doors that led to power. But there was a darkness growing in him too, a temper that flashed hot and violent, a willingness to hurt people that went beyond business, beyond necessity. Stories started circulating about what he'd done, what he was capable of doing. Some were true, some were exaggerated, but all of them served the same purpose. They made people afraid. And fear, Paul was learning, was even more valuable than money. You could always make more money. But if people feared you, really feared you, they'd give you their money before you even asked for it. The year was 1937. Paul Vario was 23 years old. He'd survived poverty, survived juvenile detention, survived the Depression. He was on his way up in the world, building the foundation of what would become a criminal empire. But he was about to make a mistake that would change everything. A mistake so violent, so brutal, that even decades later, even when Hollywood came calling to tell his story, they wouldn't dare mention it. Because some truths are too dark for the movies. Some crimes don't fit the narrative of the charming gangster, the lovable rogue, the wise guy with a heart of gold. And what Paul Vario did next would haunt him for the rest of his life. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, just know this. The boy who went to juvenile detention for skipping school was gone. In his place was something else. Something Brooklyn had created in its forgotten corners and dark alleys. Something that was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The real Paul Vario was emerging, and God help anyone who got in his way. Chapter 2. The Rape Conviction. There are crimes that define a man, and then there are crimes that reveal who he always was. 1937. Brooklyn is sweltering in the kind of summer heat that makes tempers flare and judgment disappear. Paul Vario is 23 years old, standing on the edge of everything he's been working toward. He's made connections with the Lucchese family. He's earning respect on the streets. He's got money in his pocket and a reputation that opens doors. And then, on one night, he destroys it all. The victim was 16 years old, a girl from Howard Beach, which sat just across the water from the neighborhoods Vario controlled. Her name has been lost to history, buried in old court records that most people will never read. But her trauma, her terror, her violation, that's real. That happened. That's the part of Paul Vario's story that Goodfellas never whispered, never hinted at, never acknowledged. Because how do you make a hero out of a rapist? She identified two men, Paul Vario and Anthony Romano, both of them known to police, both of them already building reputations as dangerous men in a dangerous world. The details of what happened that night remain sealed in court documents, protected by time and the bureaucratic machinery of the justice system. But the verdict was clear. Guilty. 10 years in prison. Not a slap on the wrist. Not a fine. Not probation. A decade behind bars for sexual assault. In an era when women's voices were rarely believed. When rape cases almost never led to convictions. When powerful men walked away from accusations with barely a scratch, Paul Vario was actually convicted and sentenced. Think about what that means. Think about what the evidence must have been, how credible her testimony must have been, how undeniable the crime must have been for a jury in 1937 to put a connected wise guy away for 10 years. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This wasn't a case of he said, she said that got blown out of proportion. This was rape. This was violence. This was Paul Vario showing the world exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. And here's what's even more disturbing. This wasn't a turning point for him. This wasn't the moment he realized he'd gone too far and decided to change his ways. No, prison was just an interruption, an inconvenience, a temporary setback in his criminal career. He went in at 23, young enough that 10 years might have broken him, might have convinced him to find another path. But prison in the 30s and 40s wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about warehousing human beings until society decided they could come back out. Paul Vario learned different lessons. He made connections inside that he'd used for decades. He networked with other criminals, other mobsters, other men who saw incarceration as just another cost of doing business. He lifted weights, he fought, he survived. And most importantly, he maintained his ties to the outside world, to the life he'd been building before one night of violence sent it all crashing down. But he couldn't even do his time right. Couldn't just serve a sentence and walk away. He was paroled twice during those 10 years. Twice the state looked at Paul Vario and decided maybe he'd learned his lesson, maybe he was ready to rejoin society, maybe he deserved a second chance. And twice he proved them catastrophically wrong. The first time, he was arrested again for burglary, breaking into someone's home, taking what wasn't his, violating that intimate space where people are supposed to feel safe. The second time, he was caught dealing stolen property, always hustling, always scheming, always looking for the angle even when he was supposed to be on his best behavior. Both times he was sent back to finish his sentence. Both times his parole was revoked. And you have to wonder what was going through his mind. Did he feel any remorse? Any shame? Any understanding that his actions had consequences not just for him, but for everyone around him? Or was he just angry that he got caught? The years dragged on. 1937 became 1940. The world went to war while Paul Vario sat in a cell. Hitler marched across Europe. Pearl Harbor burned. Young men his age were landing on beaches and fighting for freedom while he counted days behind bars for a crime of the most cowardly, brutal kind. 1940 became 1950. The war ended. The economy boomed. America entered a golden age of prosperity and optimism. And Paul Vario was still inside, still paying for what he'd done, still waiting for his chance to get back to the life he'd been forced to leave behind. But here's the thing about men like Paul Vario. Prison doesn't rehabilitate them. It just gives them time to plan, time to think, time to nurse grudges and build connections and prepare for the moment they can finally walk back through those gates. And every year he spent inside, his reputation on the outside grew. Because in the mob, doing time isn't shameful. It's expected. It's proof you can keep your mouth shut, proof you can handle the weight, proof you're serious about the life. The fact that he was in for rape didn't seem to matter to the men who would eventually welcome him into their ranks. Violence against women wasn't a deal breaker. If anything, it was just another demonstration of power, another sign that Paul Vario was willing to take whatever he wanted. 1950 became 1955. He was 41 years old now, no longer the young man who'd gone in. His 20s and 30s, the years when most men build careers and families and futures, he'd spent behind bars. But the mob was patient. The mob remembered. And the mob would be waiting. He was paroled again. And this time, somehow, he managed to keep his nose clean. Or more accurately, he managed not to get caught. Because men like Paul Vario don't go straight. They just get better at hiding what they do. But even then, even after years of supposedly good behavior, he couldn't quite make it work. 1960 rolled around, and he was still technically an inmate, still technically serving his sentence. 23 years after that night in Howard Beach, he was still paying the price. Or was he? Because here's what the records show. When Paul Vario finally walked out of the prison system for good in 1962, the Lucchese crime family was waiting for him with open arms. Not with judgment, not with suspicion, not with the kind of scrutiny a man with his record should have faced. No, they welcomed him like a returning hero, like someone who'd done his time and earned his place at the table. He'd lost 25 years to the criminal justice system. 25 years that should have destroyed any chance he had of building the kind of power and influence that would eventually make him a legend. 25 years that should have been a cautionary tale, a warning to other young men about what happens when you cross certain lines. Instead, those 25 years became his credentials, his proof that he was solid, that he could do hard time without breaking, without cooperating, without giving up anyone or anything. In the twisted logic of organized crime, Paul Vario's rape conviction and multiple parole violations weren't black marks on his record. They were his resume. And that 16-year-old girl from Howard Beach, she disappears from the story entirely. No follow-up, no victim impact statement, no record of what happened to her after she found the courage to identify her attackers and testify against them. She's just gone, erased from the narrative the same way Goodfellas erased this entire chapter of Paul Vario's life. Because Hollywood doesn't want to tell stories about rape victims. Hollywood wants to tell stories about charming rogues and lovable gangsters and wise guys with codes of honor. Hollywood wants Paul Sorvino playing a father figure who hosts big family dinners and gives sage advice to young Henry Hill. Hollywood doesn't want to admit that the real Paul Vario spent 25 years in the prison system because he raped a child. That's not the story they want to tell. That's not the legend they want to build. That's not the character they want Ray Liotta to admire and Robert De Niro to respect. So they just pretend it never happened. They start Paul Vario's story in the 60s, after he's already established, already powerful, already in control. They skip right over the rape conviction, the parole violations, the 2.5 decades of criminal justice system involvement that should have defined who he was. They create a sanitized version of a monster and call it entertainment. But we're not here to entertain you. We're here to tell you the truth. And the truth is that when Paul Vario walked out of prison for the last time in 1962, he was 48 years old and hungry. Hungry for money, hungry for power, hungry for respect. He'd lost the best years of his life to a cage, and someone was going to pay for it. The Lucchese family saw potential in that hunger. They saw a man who'd proven his loyalty, who'd shown he could keep his mouth shut no matter what. They saw someone who'd already demonstrated a capacity for violence, for crossing lines that other men wouldn't cross. They saw exactly what they were looking for. And Paul Vario saw his chance. His second chance, his last chance, his only chance to become everything he dreamed about as a kid running errands in South Brooklyn. The streets had changed while he was inside. The mob had evolved, grown more sophisticated, more organized. But the fundamentals were the same. Power, money, fear, respect. He was ready to take them all. But first, he had to rebuild. Had to prove himself all over again. Had to show that 25 years in the system hadn't softened him, hadn't broken him, hadn't turned him into someone who'd lost his edge. And Paul Vario would prove that in ways that would make his rape conviction look almost quaint by comparison. Because the man who emerged from prison in 1962 wasn't reformed. He wasn't rehabilitated. He wasn't sorry. He was ready to build an empire on the bodies of anyone who got in his way. Retry A. Chapter 3. Rising Through the Ranks. Freedom tastes different when you've lost 25 years to concrete and steel. Paul Vario walked out of the prison system in 1962, and Brooklyn had changed. The neighborhoods he remembered from his youth had shifted, evolved, been carved up and redistributed among new players and old families. But the game itself remained the same, and Paul Vario knew how to play. He was 48 years old, in the straight world that would make him middle-aged, past his prime, settling into a comfortable routine. But in the mob, 48 with 25 years of hard time behind you made you dangerous, made you proven, made you someone the bosses could trust with real responsibility. The Lucchese crime family didn't waste time. They saw what Paul Vario could be, what he'd already demonstrated he was willing to do. They gave him a crew, not a huge operation, not the kind of empire that would draw too much attention from law enforcement. Just a small piece of Brooklyn, a foothold, a chance to prove that all those years inside hadn't dulled his instincts. He set up operations in Canarsie, a working-class neighborhood where the docks met residential streets, where legitimate businesses operated right alongside illegal ones, where a man with the right connections could make serious money if he was smart enough and brutal enough to hold on to it. His headquarters wasn't some fancy social club with leather chairs and expensive scotch. It was a junkyard on Avenue D, literally a yard filled with rusted metal and broken-down cars, the kind of place most people would drive past without a second glance. But that was exactly the point. The junkyard was perfect, hidden in plain sight, easy to explain to anyone who asked questions, impossible to bug effectively with all that metal and machinery creating interference. And from that junkyard, Paul Vario started building something that would eventually touch every illegal enterprise in East New York. He also ran operations from an old German bar called Gefkin's on Flatlands Avenue. The bar had been there for decades, a neighborhood institution where working men came to drink away their wages and forget about their troubles. Now it became something else, a place where bookmakers took bets, where loan sharks collected debts, where stolen goods changed hands, where the real business of organized crime happened in whispered conversations and backroom deals. Paul Vario wasn't flashy about it. He'd learned something during those years inside, learned that the gangsters who lived large and drew attention were the ones who ended up dead or back in prison. He kept a low profile, didn't put his name on anything, never owned property in his own name, used his brothers as fronts for his legitimate businesses. He had a rule that would serve him for the rest of his criminal career. Never put your name on anything. Never leave a paper trail. Never give the government something they could trace back to you in a courtroom. It was smart. It was careful. It was the kind of thinking that kept men like him out of prison while flashier gangsters got themselves arrested for tax evasion. But make no mistake, Paul Vario was building an empire. It started with loan sharking, which is just a fancy word for predatory lending backed by violence. A desperate man comes to you needing money. Maybe his kid is sick. Maybe he gambled away his paycheck. Maybe he just made bad choices, and now bill collectors are circling. You give him the money, and you charge him interest that would make a credit card company blush. 5% a week, 10%, sometimes more. The math is brutal and intentional. Borrow $1,000, and within a few months you owe $5,000. Within a year, you're so deep in debt you'll never climb out. And when you can't pay, that's when the real collection begins. Paul Vario didn't do the collections himself. Not anymore. He had people for that. Young guys trying to prove themselves, trying to earn their way into the life. They'd show up at your job, at your home, at your kid's school. They'd break fingers, break legs, break whatever needed to be broken until the money materialized. And if you still couldn't pay, if you'd exhausted every option and every friend and every relative who might lend you money, then you started working for Paul Vario. Directly or indirectly, you became part of his machine. Maybe you worked at the airport and could provide information about shipments. Maybe you drove a truck and could look the other way while it was hijacked. Maybe you had access to something valuable that could be stolen and sold. Everyone had something Paul Vario could use. And once you were in debt to him, once that hook was set deep in your jaw, you'd spend the rest of your life trying to work it free. Bookmaking was another pillar of his operation. Sports betting was illegal then, which meant anyone who wanted to put money on a horse race or a boxing match or a baseball game had to go through guys like Paul Vario. The beauty of bookmaking was that the house always won. The odds were set so that even when you paid out on winning bets, you still came out ahead. And if someone got too lucky, won too much, you could always refuse to pay and dare them to do something about it. What were they going to do? Call the cops and explain they were engaging in illegal gambling. Fencing stolen goods completed the triangle. Thieves need someone to sell to, and legitimate buyers don't ask questions when they can get merchandise at half price. Paul Vario became the middleman, the guy who could take a truckload of stolen cigarettes or hijacked electronics and turn it into cash. He took his cut, the thieves took theirs, and everyone made money. Except the companies that got robbed, of course. But they had insurance. They'd be fine. That's how Paul Vario justified it, if he bothered to justify it at all. The operation grew. Month by month, year by year, Paul Vario's influence spread through East New York like a stain. He wasn't just running rackets anymore. He was controlling territory. Other criminals paid him tribute, paid him for the privilege of operating in his neighborhoods. Legitimate businesses paid him protection money, paid him to make sure nothing bad happened to their storefronts or their delivery trucks. It was extortion dressed up as a service. We'll protect you from all the terrible things that might happen, things that coincidentally will definitely happen if you don't pay us. It's an old racket, simple and effective, and Paul Vario ran it like a business. His crew grew too. He needed soldiers, guys who could enforce his will, collect his debts, handle the violence that was always bubbling just beneath the surface of organized crime. One of those guys was Henry Hill, a half-Irish kid from the neighborhood who'd been running errands for the mob since he was young enough to be impressed by men in nice suits. Hill was smart, hungry, and most importantly, he understood that his Irish heritage meant he could never be made, could never become a full member of the Italian Mafia. But he could work for them. He could earn for them. And if he proved himself valuable enough, he could get rich doing it. Paul Vario saw potential in Henry Hill, saw someone who could be molded, trained, used. The same way he'd been spotted and cultivated as a kid in South Brooklyn. Now he was doing the recruiting, building his own crew, creating a network of criminals who owed him their loyalty and their earnings. Another key player was Jimmy Burke, who became one of Paul Vario's most trusted associates. Burke was a hijacker, a specialist in stealing trucks loaded with valuable cargo. He was also a killer, though that information wouldn't become clear until much later. For now, he was just another earner in Paul Vario's crew, another piece on the chessboard. And then there was Tommy DeSimone, a psychopath with a hair-trigger temper who killed people the way other men swatted flies. Casual, easy, without hesitation or remorse. DeSimone was useful when you needed someone hurt or dead, but he was also dangerous, unpredictable, the kind of guy who could cause problems if he wasn't carefully managed. Paul Vario managed him, managed all of them, because by the mid-60s, Paul Vario wasn't just another soldier in the Lucchese family. He was a made man, a full member of the Mafia, someone who'd been formally inducted into the organization with all the ceremony and ritual that entailed. And more than that, he'd been promoted to capo regime, a captain, a boss in his own right, answering only to the family leadership. He commanded his own crew now, had his own territory, made his own decisions about who lived and who died, who got rich and who got buried. In 1965, opportunity knocked again. A mobster named Jake Colombo died, leaving behind a lucrative gambling operation in the Cedarhurst and Inwood sections of Long Island. These were upscale neighborhoods, places where wealthy people lived and wealthy people loved to gamble. The potential earnings were enormous. Paul Vario moved fast. He took control of those operations before anyone else could stake a claim, expanding his territory, increasing his income, solidifying his position as one of the most powerful capos in the Lucchese family. He was operating numbers rackets, running bookmaking operations, controlling who could gamble and who couldn't in some of the richest areas of New York. But success brings attention. Law enforcement started noticing patterns, started connecting dots, started building cases. In late 1965, Long Island officials arrested Paul Vario along with 8 others and charged them with controlling a gambling ring. The next year, Nassau County came after him again, arresting him with 17 others for running a bookmaking operation. These weren't minor busts. These were serious charges that could send him back to prison for years. But Paul Vario had learned how to work the system. He had lawyers now. Good ones. The kind who knew how to exploit loopholes and challenge evidence and create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. The cases dragged on. Some charges stuck, some didn't, but Paul Vario kept operating. Because in the mob, getting arrested is just part of the cost of doing business. You factor it in, budget for the legal fees, plan for the possibility that you might have to do some time. And if you do go away, your crew keeps earning, keeps operating, keeps sending money to your family while you're gone. Meanwhile, Paul Vario was diversifying. He understood that a smart criminal doesn't put all his eggs in one basket. He opened legitimate businesses. A flower shop, a bar, a restaurant, a taxi stand that became his unofficial office. The place where people came when they needed to talk to Paulie, when they needed permission or protection or a favor they couldn't ask for anywhere else. One of his most important fronts was Vario's Bargain Auto Parts Incorporated, located at his junkyard on Avenue D. On paper, it was a legitimate business buying and selling used car parts. In reality, it was a chop shop where stolen cars were stripped and sold for parts, where hijacked trucks were hidden until the heat died down, where the real business of Paul Vario's criminal empire happened behind closed doors. He was 51 years old now. Most men would be thinking about retirement, about grandchildren, about slowing down and enjoying what they'd built. But Paul Vario was just getting started. He had money. He had power. He had respect. And he had something even more valuable. He had access to John F. Kennedy International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world, where millions of dollars in cargo moved through every single day. Cargo that could be stolen. Cargo that could make a connected guy very, very rich. Paul Vario looked at that airport and saw opportunity. Saw the future. Saw the next phase of his empire. He had no idea he was building toward the biggest robbery in American history. Had no idea that his crew would pull off a heist so audacious, so successful, that it would become legend. Had no idea that the Lufthansa Heist would also be the beginning of the end. But that was still years away. For now, in the late 60s, Paul Vario was on top of the world. A made man, a captain, a boss. Everything he'd dreamed about as a kid, running through the streets of Brooklyn. Everything he'd plotted during those 25 years behind bars. He'd earned his place through violence and cunning and an absolute refusal to play by anyone's rules but his own. And now, finally, after decades of struggle and sacrifice, Paul Vario was exactly where he wanted to be. In control. Chapter 4, The Airport King. John F. Kennedy International Airport wasn't just a transportation hub. It was a gold mine with runways. Every single day, cargo planes landed carrying goods from all over the world. Electronics from Japan, jewelry from Europe, cash, lots of cash, being transferred between banks and countries. Designer clothes, luxury watches, pharmaceutical supplies, precious metals. If it was valuable and it was moving through New York, it probably touched down at JFK at some point. And Paul Vario understood something that most people didn't. Airports are vulnerable. Not the passenger terminals with their security checkpoints and cameras and armed guards. No, the cargo facilities. The warehouses where goods sat overnight waiting to be loaded onto trucks. The loading docks where a small crew could work without attracting much attention. The system of workers and drivers and handlers who made barely enough money to survive. Workers who could be corrupted. Workers who could be threatened. Workers who, for the right price or the right amount of fear, would look the other way while trucks full of merchandise simply disappeared into the night. Paul Vario had been cultivating relationships at JFK since the early 60s. It started small like everything he did. A worker here who owed him gambling debts. A truck driver there who needed a loan. A union official who appreciated generous gifts at Christmas. Piece by piece, person by person, Paul Vario built a network of influence that gave him eyes and ears throughout the entire airport complex. And once he had information, once he knew what was coming in and when and where it would be stored, hijacking became almost easy, almost routine. His crew would get a tip about a valuable shipment. They'd wait until it was loaded onto a truck. Then they'd simply take it, sometimes with violence, sometimes just with the implicit threat of violence. A gun in your face tends to make truck drivers very cooperative. The beauty of the operation was its simplicity. Steal the truck, drive it to a warehouse or a chop shop, unload the merchandise, abandon the truck somewhere would eventually be found. By the time police responded, by the time investigators started asking questions, the goods would already be halfway to being fenced, converted into untraceable cash. Paul Vario's cut from these operations was substantial. Every successful hijacking meant tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands, divided among the crew, with the biggest shares going to the guys at the top. And Paul Vario was always at the top. But he wasn't content to just steal cargo. That was small-time thinking, the kind of short-term strategy that eventually gets you caught. No, Paul Vario understood that real power came from controlling the system itself. So he went after the unions. The cargo handlers union, the truck drivers union, the freight workers union. These organizations controlled who got hired, who got fired, who got the good shifts and the overtime and the benefits. And unions, Paul Vario understood, could be infiltrated, could be manipulated, could be turned into instruments of organized crime. He started by offering favors. A union official needs a loan. Paul Vario provides it at a reasonable rate. A shop steward has a problem with a bookie. Paul Vario makes it disappear. Small favors that create obligations. And obligations, in Paul Vario's world, were currency. Then came the threats. Subtle at first. A reminder that accidents happen at airports. Forklifts malfunction. Cargo falls. People get hurt. And sometimes those accidents happen to people who don't cooperate, who don't understand that certain individuals need to be kept happy if everyone wants to keep working in a safe environment. The unions folded. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough that Paul Vario could ensure his people got jobs at the airport. Enough that he could guarantee certain trucks would be left unguarded at certain times. Enough that when law enforcement tried to investigate, when federal agents started asking questions, suddenly everyone developed amnesia. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew anything. Nobody was willing to testify. And without witnesses, without cooperation, investigations stalled and died. Cases fell apart. Prosecutors gave up. And Paul Vario kept operating, kept stealing, kept getting richer while the government fumbled around trying to figure out how to stop him. By the late 60s, Paul Vario effectively controlled most of the criminal activity at JFK Airport. Not officially, of course. His name didn't appear on any documents. He didn't have an office or a title or anything that could connect him directly to what was happening. But everyone who mattered knew. Every hijacker, every fence, every corrupt union official, every criminal operating in and around that airport knew that Paul Vario was the man you answered to, the man you paid tribute to, the man who could shut down your operation with a single phone call if you stepped out of line. It was a kingdom built on fear and corruption, and Paul Vario was its undisputed king. But he was smart enough to maintain plausible deniability. He operated through layers of insulation, through intermediaries and associates who took the direct risks while he remained safely in the background. Jimmy Burke handled a lot of the actual hijackings. Henry Hill coordinated with the inside men at the airport. Tommy DeSimone provided muscle when negotiations needed encouragement. Paul Vario just collected his percentage and made sure everyone understood the rules. Don't get greedy. Don't attract unnecessary attention. Don't talk to cops. And most importantly, don't forget who's in charge. He reinforced these rules with violence when necessary. A truck driver who considered cooperating with investigators might find himself beaten so badly he'd never consider it again. A cargo handler who tried to freelance, who tried to set up his own hijacking operation without paying tribute to Paul Vario, might simply disappear. Not always killed, though sometimes that happened too, but disappeared in the sense that he'd lose his job, lose his union card, find himself unemployable at every airport and dock and warehouse in New York. Paul Vario didn't need to kill everyone who crossed him. sometimes destroying a man's livelihood, taking away his ability to feed his family, that sent a more powerful message than murder. It said, "I can make you nothing. I can erase you from the world without ever touching you." And that kind of power was intoxicating. Of course, running a criminal empire required infrastructure, required places to meet, to plan, to count money, and divide up the spoils. Paul Vario maintained multiple locations for these purposes, each one serving a slightly different function in his organization. The junkyard on Avenue D remained his primary base of operations. It was where serious business happened, where major decisions were made, where Paul Vario held court like some kind of twisted monarch presiding over a kingdom of rust and stolen goods. The noise of the junkyard, the constant clang of metal and roar of machinery, made it almost impossible to conduct electronic surveillance. Even if the FBI managed to plant a bug, which they tried to do multiple times, the audio would be useless, drowned out by ambient sound. Gefkin's bar on Flatlands Avenue served a different purpose. It was more public, more social, a place where lower-level associates could come and be seen, where bookmakers took bets and loan sharks made collections, where the day-to-day operations of organized crime happened in full view of anyone who cared to look. But nothing too incriminating ever happened there. Nothing that could be used in court. Paul Vario made sure of that. He also operated legitimate businesses, and he used them brilliantly as both income sources and covers for illegal activity. His flower shop wasn't just a front. It actually made money, actually served customers, actually provided floral arrangements for weddings and funerals. But it also provided a legitimate explanation for cash income, a way to launder money from his illegal enterprises by mixing it with legal earnings. The bar and restaurant worked the same way. Real customers, real business, but also a perfect cover for meetings and money transfers, and all the little transactions that kept organized crime running smoothly. The taxi stand became famous in mob circles, the place where you could find Paulie if you needed to talk, if you had a problem that required his attention. And then there was Vario's Bargain Auto Parts Incorporated. On paper, a struggling small business selling used car parts. In reality, a chop shop where stolen vehicles were disassembled and sold off piece by piece, where hijacked trucks were hidden until they could be safely moved, where the physical evidence of Paul Vario's crimes was systematically destroyed and converted into profit. He never put his name on any of these businesses. Never. They were registered to his brothers, to trusted associates, to shell companies with lawyers who knew how to create corporate structures that shielded Paul Vario from legal liability. If the cops came knocking, if investigators started asking questions, there would be no paper trail leading back to him. It was brilliant, really. Frustrating as hell for law enforcement, but brilliant. And it wasn't just about the money, though the money was substantial. Paul Vario was pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year by the late 60s. Maybe more. It's hard to know for sure because he didn't exactly file tax returns on his criminal income. But based on what we know about similar operations, based on testimony from Henry Hill and other associates who eventually cooperated with authorities, Paul Vario was getting rich. Very rich. But money was just a tool. What Paul Vario really wanted was power. Control. The ability to walk into any room and have people understand immediately that he was someone important, someone dangerous, someone who demanded respect. And he got it. By the end of the 1960s, Paul Vario was one of the most powerful capos in the Lucchese crime family. He controlled territory that generated enormous income. He commanded a crew of capable, violent men who would do whatever he asked without question. He had politicians and union officials and businessmen in his pocket. He had cops looking the other way because they were on his payroll, or because they were too afraid to investigate too deeply. He had built everything he dreamed about during those years in prison, had proven that 25 years behind bars hadn't broken him, hadn't softened him, hadn't taken away his hunger for power and money and respect. But there was a darkness in Paul Vario that went beyond normal criminal ambition, a capacity for violence that exceeded what was necessary for business. Stories circulated about his temper, about what happened when people disappointed him or disrespected him or simply caught him on a bad day. There was the famous incident at a restaurant called Don Pepe's Vesuvio. Paul Vario and his wife Phyllis went out for dinner, looking forward to a nice meal. But the maitre d' kept seating other parties ahead of them, kept making them wait, even though Paul Vario was someone who never waited for anything. He complained, loudly, made a scene. Eventually they were seated, but by then Paul Vario was already angry, already looking for a reason to explode. When they ordered wine, the maitre d' came to pour it. Whether it was an accident or deliberate retaliation for Paul Vario's earlier behavior, the wine spilled all over Phyllis. Paul Vario lost his mind. Not in the moment, not right there in the restaurant where witnesses could testify about what happened. No, he waited, planned, and then he sent his entire crew to that restaurant. Every single member of his organization, dozens of men, descended on Don Pepe's Vesuvio and beat the staff bloody. The maitre d', the waiters, anyone who worked there. They destroyed the place, hospitalized multiple people, sent a message that resonated throughout Brooklyn. You don't disrespect Paul Vario. You don't disrespect his wife. You don't even accidentally inconvenience them without facing consequences that will haunt you for the rest of your life. It was excessive. It was psychotic. It was exactly the kind of violent overreaction that showed Paul Vario wasn't just a businessman operating outside the law. He was something darker, something more dangerous. A man whose ego and temper could turn a minor slight into a bloodbath. And the scary part was that nobody could stop him. The restaurant staff couldn't go to the police because they knew what would happen if they did. The police couldn't build a case because nobody would testify. Paul Vario's own crew couldn't question his orders because that was a good way to end up in a shallow grave. He operated with impunity, protected by a combination of fear, loyalty, and the inherent corruption of the system he'd spent decades infiltrating. By 1970, Paul Vario had achieved a level of power that most criminals only dream about. He was 56 years old, at the peak of his influence, commanding respect throughout the New York underworld. He had money in the bank, or more accurately, money hidden in walls and buried in backyards and stuffed in safety deposit boxes under fake names. He had a crew that earned for him and killed for him and never questioned him. He had union officials and businessmen and law enforcement officers who either worked for him or were too afraid to work against him. He had everything a gangster could want, and yet it still wasn't enough. It's never enough for men like Paul Vario. There's always another score, another opportunity, another chance to prove just how powerful and untouchable you really are. The airport operations were generating steady income, but steady wasn't exciting. Steady didn't make history. Steady didn't cement your legend in the criminal underworld. Paul Vario wanted something bigger, something that would make people remember his name decades after he was gone. He had no idea that opportunity was already forming, that a desperate Lufthansa cargo supervisor with gambling debts was about to walk into his world with information about millions of dollars sitting in an airport vault. That Jimmy Burke was about to propose the kind of heist that seemed impossible. That Paul Vario was about to give his approval for the crime that would define his legacy and eventually destroy everything he'd built. But in 1970, all of that was still ahead of him. For now, Paul Vario was simply the undisputed king of JFK Airport, the man who controlled the flow of illegal goods and money through one of the busiest transportation hubs in the world. And he intended to stay king for a very long time. Chapter 5. The Violent Truth. Power doesn't corrupt. It reveals. Paul Vario had spent decades building a reputation as someone you didn't cross, someone who commanded respect through a combination of intelligence and brutality. But respect built on fear requires maintenance. It requires reminders. It requires a willingness to demonstrate, again and again, that the consequences of disrespect are severe and immediate. And Paul Vario was more than willing to provide those demonstrations. Federal prosecutors didn't mince words when they finally got the chance to describe him in court documents. They called him one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. Not just a criminal, not just a mobster, one of the most violent and dangerous. In a city full of killers and psychopaths and men who made their living hurting people, Paul Vario stood out. That should tell you something about who he really was. The movie version of Paulie Cicero, the The character Paul Sorvino brought to life in Goodfellas was calm, measured, almost philosophical. He was the wise elder statesman of the crew, the father figure who gave advice and hosted family dinners and tried to keep the younger guys from making stupid mistakes. He rarely raised his voice, never lost control, was always thinking 3 moves ahead with the cool calculation of a chess master. That wasn't Paul Vario. That was Hollywood's fantasy of what a mob boss should be. The reality was so much uglier. Paul Vario had a hair-trigger temper that could explode over the smallest perceived slight. He was paranoid, violent, and completely unpredictable. One moment he could be laughing and joking. The next he'd be beating someone with his fists until they couldn't stand up. And there was no logic to it. No way to anticipate what would set him off. A wrong word. A sideways glance. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was enough. His physical presence added to the menace. At 6 feet 3 inches tall, Paul Vario was an imposing figure in an era when the average man was several inches shorter. He wasn't just tall either. He was heavy, built like someone who'd done hard labor and hard time, someone whose body was a weapon all by itself. When Paul Vario walked into a room, people noticed. When he got angry, people ran. The story about the restaurant incident at Don Pepe's Vesuvio wasn't an isolated event. It was a pattern. Paul Vario's response to minor disrespect was always disproportionate, always excessive, always designed to send a message that resonated far beyond the immediate victim. But that night at the restaurant revealed something particularly disturbing about Paul Vario's psychology. It wasn't just about him. It was about his wife, Phyllis. He adored her, was obsessively protective of her, and anyone who disrespected her was signing their own death warrant, or at least their own hospitalization papers. Henry Hill, who worked closely with Paul Vario for years, later recounted the incident in detail. The way Paul Vario's face changed when the wine spilled on Phyllis. The way his voice got quiet, which was always more dangerous than when he yelled. The way he didn't react in the moment, but instead let the rage simmer and build until it erupted into something truly terrible. He assembled his entire crew, not just the guys directly involved in his operations, but everyone. Soldiers, associates, guys who were barely connected to him, but understood that when Paulie called, you showed up. Dozens of men converged on that restaurant like an invading army. They didn't just beat the maitre d'. They beat everyone. Waiters, busboys, the bartender, the cook who wandered out to see what the commotion was about. They broke furniture. They smashed glasses. They turned a respectable restaurant into a war zone. And they did it with the systematic thoroughness of men who'd been given permission to unleash all their worst impulses. Multiple people ended up in the hospital. The restaurant had to close for repairs. And the message was received throughout Brooklyn and beyond. Paul Vario will destroy you for nothing. For an accident. For bad timing. For being employed at the wrong place when his wife's dress got stained. If he'd do that over spilled wine, what would he do if you actually betrayed him? If you stole from him? If you cooperated with law enforcement? The answer was clear, and it kept people in line more effectively than any threat could have. But violence wasn't just about maintaining control. For Paul Vario, it seemed to be something deeper, something psychological, a need to dominate, to hurt, to prove his power not just over people's livelihoods, but over their bodies, their dignity, their sense of safety in the world. His crew learned to read his moods, to recognize the signs that Paul Vario was about to explode. The way his jaw clenched, the way he got very still before the storm hit. Smart guys made themselves scarce when they saw those signs. Unlucky guys ended up as object lessons. And then there was July 20th, 1973, a date that should have been just another summer day, but instead became one of the most mysterious and tragic events in Paul Vario's life. His son Leonard died that day. He was rushed to Wyckoff Heights Medical Center in Queens with severe burns covering his body. The kind of burns that come from fire, from being caught in an inferno, from something going catastrophically wrong. He died from those burns. And to this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. The cause of his injuries was never discovered, never officially explained, never resolved into a coherent narrative that made sense. But there were rumors. There are always rumors when something terrible happens to someone connected to organized crime. Some said Leonard was involved in union-related arson that went wrong, that he was supposed to torture property, maybe as part of an insurance fraud scheme, or maybe to intimidate someone, and something went wrong. The fire got out of control. He got trapped. He burned. Others whispered darker theories. That Leonard had crossed someone. That the burns weren't accidental at all, but deliberate. A message sent to Paul Vario by enemies or rivals or someone with a grudge. That his son had been murdered in one of the most painful ways imaginable. Paul Vario never spoke publicly about what happened. Never offered an explanation. Never pointed fingers or sought revenge in any obvious way. The mystery just hung there, unresolved, another dark chapter in a life full of them. But what happened at Leonard's funeral spoke volumes about the Vario family and the world they inhabited. 2 television cameramen showed up, probably expecting to document the funeral of a mobster's son, to get footage they could use for news reports about organized crime in New York. Maybe a police detective attended too, watching, taking notes, try to gather intelligence about who attended and who didn't. They were all beaten, savagely, in full view of mourners and anyone else who happened to be present. The cameraman's equipment was smashed. The detective was hospitalized. And the message was clear once again. The Vario family doesn't tolerate intrusion. They don't tolerate investigation. They don't tolerate anything that suggests they're accountable to anyone outside their own close circle. It was a public display of contempt for law and order, for basic human decency, for the idea that even at a funeral, even in a moment of grief, there should be some boundaries that even criminals respect. But Paul Vario didn't believe in boundaries. Not for himself, not for his family, not for anyone under his protection. The violence extended beyond personal slights and family tragedies. It was built into every aspect of his criminal operations. Loan sharking required violence. When people couldn't pay, you had to collect with fists and baseball bats and tire irons. Had to break bones and inflict enough pain that the victim would find the money somehow, would mortgage their house or steal from their employer or sell everything they owned rather than face another visit from Paul Vario's collection crew. Hijacking required violence. Truck drivers don't just hand over their cargo because you ask nicely. You stick a gun in their face. You threaten their families. You make it clear that resistance means death, and cooperation means they get to go home to their kids that night. Most drivers cooperated. The ones who didn't became cautionary tales. Even the gambling operations, which seem relatively benign compared to the rest of Paul Vario's empire, were backed by the implicit threat of violence. Don't pay your gambling debts, and you'll answer to people who specialize in making you wish you'd paid. Try to run a competing operation without paying tribute to Paul Vario, and you'll discover exactly how violent and dangerous he could be. His crew reflected his personality. Jimmy Burke was charming on the surface, but capable of incredible brutality when the situation called for it. He'd eventually become one of the most prolific killers in mob history, though that wouldn't be fully understood until later. Tommy DeSimone was a complete psychopath, someone who killed for fun as much as for business, someone whose violence was so casual and frequent that even other mobsters were afraid of him. These weren't accidents. Paul Vario didn't surround himself with violent men by chance. He cultivated them. He rewarded them. He created an environment where violence was not just accepted but expected, where the ability to hurt and kill people was valued more than any other skill. And he led by example. There are stories from people who worked with him, who saw him in action, who witnessed firsthand what Paul Vario was capable of when he decided someone needed to be hurt. He didn't always delegate. Sometimes he did it himself. Sometimes he wanted to feel the impact, to see the fear in someone's eyes, to physically dominate another human being in the most primal way possible. That's not business. That's something else. That's pathology. By the early 1970s, Paul Vario's reputation for violence had spread far beyond his immediate territory. Other crime families knew about him. Law enforcement agencies had thick files documenting his criminal career. Prosecutors desperately wanted to put him away, but struggled to find witnesses willing to testify, struggled to build cases that would survive the legal challenges his expensive lawyers could mount. Because that was another aspect of Paul Vario's operation. The violence kept people quiet. The fear he instilled was so profound, so deeply rooted, that even people who had every reason to cooperate with authorities chose to remain silent. They'd rather risk prison themselves than risk what would happen if they testified against Paul Vario. He had created a culture of omerta that extended beyond the traditional Mafia code of silence. It wasn't just about honor or loyalty or tradition. It was about survival. Talk and you die. Talk and your family dies. Talk and everyone you've ever cared about will suffer consequences that make death look merciful. And people believed it, because they'd seen what happened to people who crossed Paul Vario. They'd seen the bodies. They'd heard the stories. They knew that his capacity for violence wasn't limited by conscience or remorse or any of the normal human emotions that keep most people from inflicting maximum harm on their fellow human beings. The contrast with the Goodfellas portrayal couldn't be more stark. Martin Scorsese made a masterpiece, no question. The film is brilliant. The performances are iconic. But in creating art, in crafting a narrative that audiences could connect with, they sanitized Paul Vario. They took one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in New York City and turned him into a kindly uncle figure who just happened to run an illegal business. They showed him hosting family dinners where everyone laughed and joked and enjoyed each other's company. They showed him giving fatherly advice to young Henry Hill. They showed him as calm, rational, strategic. A man who used violence only when absolutely necessary, and even then with reluctance. That wasn't Paul Vario. That was a fiction designed to make audiences comfortable with a character who, if portrayed accurately, would have been unwatchable. Nobody wants to spend 2.5 hours watching a genuine sociopath terrorize everyone around him. Nobody wants to empathize with someone whose response to spilled wine is to hospitalize an entire restaurant staff. So Hollywood made a choice. They kept the broad strokes of Paul Vario's story, but sanded down the rough edges. They eliminated the rape conviction. They minimized the violence. They created a version of Paul Vario that could exist in a mainstream movie, that could be played by a beloved character actor like Paul Sorvino, that audiences could watch without feeling complicit in celebrating a truly terrible human being. And it worked. Goodfellas is considered one of the greatest films ever made. Paul Sorvino's performance is remembered fondly. The character of Paulie Cicero has become iconic, a representation of a certain type of mob boss that exists more in imagination than in reality. But the real Paul Vario deserves to be remembered too. Not celebrated, not romanticized, but remembered for what he actually was. A violent, dangerous criminal who built an empire on fear and maintained it through systematic brutality. A man who federal prosecutors accurately described as one of the worst of the worst. A man whose own son died under mysterious circumstances and whose response was to have mourners beat journalists and police at the funeral. A man who sent dozens of criminals to destroy a restaurant because his wife's dress got stained. A man whose temper was so legendary, so unpredictable, that even members of his own crew lived in constant fear of setting him off. That was Paul Vario. That was the truth. And that truth was far too dark for Hollywood to touch. So they created a comfortable lie instead and hoped nobody would dig deep enough to discover what really happened in the shadows where Paul Vario operated. But the truth has a way of surviving. It lives in court documents and FBI reports and the testimony of people who eventually found the courage to speak. It lives in hospital records and police files and the fading memories of people who knew him, who worked for him, who feared him. Paul Vario was a monster, a successful monster, a powerful monster, but a monster nonetheless. And no amount of movie magic can change that fundamental reality. Chapter 6. The law closes in. You can only operate in the shadows for so long before someone turns on a light. By 1970, Paul Vario had built an empire that touched nearly every illegal enterprise in East New York. His operations generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. His crew controlled significant territory. His influence extended into unions, businesses, and even law enforcement. He seemed untouchable, protected by layers of insulation and a wall of silence built on fear. But the FBI doesn't give up. They just get more creative. In 1970, Paul Vario was cited for contempt of court. The exact circumstances are buried in legal documents, but the outcome was clear. 7 months in the Nassau County Correctional Facility on Long Island. Not a long sentence by criminal standards, but long enough to be inconvenient. Long enough to disrupt his operations. Long enough to remind him that for all his power, for all his connections, he could still be touched by the legal system. He served his 7 months, kept his mouth shut, maintained his connections on the outside, and when he walked out, he went right back to business as usual. Because that's what guys like Paul Vario do. Prison is just a pause button, a temporary interruption. The game continues whether you're inside or out. But the authorities were learning. They were watching. They were building cases slowly, methodically, the way you have to when your target is smart enough not to leave obvious evidence lying around. In 1971, the Gefkin family decided to sell their bar, the place that had been a fixture on Flatlands Avenue for decades, the place Paul Vario had turned into an unofficial headquarters for his operations. They sold it to Peter Abinanti, a friend of Paul Vario's, for $40,000. On paper, it was a simple real estate transaction. In reality, it was Paul Vario maintaining control while putting the property in someone else's name. Never put your name on anything. The rule he lived by. The rule that kept him out of prison while less careful criminals got themselves arrested for tax evasion and wire fraud. But the FBI was getting smarter too. On April 7, 1972, they made a move that would prove crucial. They planted an electronic listening device inside Paul Vario's trailer at the junkyard. Not an easy task. The junkyard was his fortress, the place he felt safest, the place where he conducted his most sensitive business. Getting surveillance equipment in there without being detected required careful planning and perfect timing. They managed it, and suddenly, the FBI was listening to conversations that revealed the scope and nature of Paul Vario's criminal enterprise. They were gathering evidence, building a case, documenting crimes in Paul Vario's own words. But electronic surveillance alone wouldn't be enough. They needed more. They needed someone on the inside, someone Paul Vario would trust. So they sent in a cop, a detective wearing a wire, playing the part of a corrupt officer looking to make some extra money. It was a dangerous play. If Paul Vario suspected anything, if he ran a background check or asked the wrong questions or simply relied on his instincts, the detective would be exposed. And exposed undercover officers in mob investigations tend to turn up dead. But the detective played his role perfectly. He started visiting the trailer, making small talk, establishing rapport, and Paul Vario, convinced he'd found another cop on the take, started offering him bribes, started discussing business, started saying things that could be used against him in court. The entire surveillance operation lasted about 6 months. 6 months of careful documentation, 6 months of recorded conversations and photograph meetings and compiled evidence. The FBI was patient. They let the case build. Let Paul Vario incriminate himself over and over again. And then, in October 1972, they struck. Police raided the junkyard in Canarsie, descended on Paul Vario's headquarters with warrants and badges and the accumulated evidence of months of investigation. They tore the place apart looking for additional evidence, seized documents, made arrests. Paul Vario must have known in that moment that his carefully constructed world was starting to crack. On November 1st, 1972, he was indicted on charges of tampering with a witness. The accusation was that he'd advised Frank Heitman, a convicted gambler, to flee to Florida to avoid testifying to a grand jury in Nassau County. It's a classic mob move. Someone's about to testify against you. You help them disappear before they can talk. You make it clear that cooperation with authorities is dangerous to their health. But witness tampering is a serious federal crime. And the authorities had evidence. They had recordings. They had testimony. They had Paul Vario trapped. The day they came to arrest him, November 1st, Paul Vario was tipped off. Maybe a corrupt cop called ahead. Maybe someone saw the police mobilizing and got word to him. But somehow, he knew they were coming. And instead of surrendering peacefully, Instead of accepting the inevitable and maintaining whatever dignity he could, Paul Vario ran. He got in his car and led police on a chase through the streets of Brooklyn. For 20 minutes, he drove like a maniac, weaving through traffic, running red lights, doing everything he could to escape. 20 minutes of pure adrenaline and desperation. A powerful mob boss reduced to fleeing like a common criminal. Eventually he stopped. Whether he ran out of options or simply realized the futility of running, we don't know. But the police caught him, arrested him, took him into custody. And the image of Paul Vario being chased through Brooklyn like a rat must have been humiliating for someone who'd spent decades cultivating an image of power and control. But the legal troubles were just beginning. On November 21st, 1972, just 3 weeks after the witness tampering indictment, Paul Vario was indicted again, this time for insurance fraud. He and several co-conspirators had stripped a boat of its equipment, deliberately sunk it, and then filed a $7,000 insurance claim. It was small-time stuff compared to his other operations. $7,000 was pocket change for someone pulling in the kind of money Paul Vario made from hijacking and loan sharking. But it showed a pattern. Showed that Paul Vario was willing to commit fraud at any level, that no scheme was beneath him if it generated income. And from a prosecutor's perspective, small crimes are often easier to prove than big ones. The conspiracy is smaller. Fewer people involved means fewer chances for someone to keep their mouth shut. The evidence is more straightforward. You can show a jury the boat, the insurance claim, the timeline of events, and make a clear case that fraud occurred. Then came December 7th, 1972. Another indictment. This one included charges related to attempting to bribe the officer of the trailer. The cop who'd been wearing a wire, who'd been documenting Paul Vario's attempts to corrupt him. Now those attempts were being turned into criminal charges. Paul Vario must have felt the walls closing in. 3 indictments in just over a month. Multiple investigations. Evidence piling up. The careful structure he'd built to insulate himself from prosecution was failing. His rule about never putting his name on anything didn't protect him when the FBI had recordings of his voice offering bribes. And he couldn't even stay out of trouble while facing these serious charges. In December 1972, the same month as his bribery indictment, Paul Vario pleaded guilty to drunk driving. A stupid, avoidable crime. The kind of thing that shows a man losing control, making bad decisions, letting stress and pressure affect his judgment. He received probation. But probation requires compliance with certain rules. Requires staying out of trouble. Requires checking in with a probation officer and following restrictions on your behavior. And Paul Vario, who'd spent his entire adult life refusing to follow anyone's rules but his own, couldn't manage it. By early 1973, he'd violated his probation. By February, he was back in jail. And this time, the charges were even more serious. On February 9th, 1973, Paul Vario was convicted on tax evasion charges. The same crime that brought down Al Capone. The same crime that ensnared countless mobsters who thought they were too smart to get caught. Because no matter how careful you are about your criminal enterprises, no matter how many layers of insulation you create, the government can always follow the money. Paul Vario was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and reporting a fraction of it to the IRS. He was living beyond what his legitimate businesses could possibly support. And federal investigators, working with the evidence they'd gathered during the surveillance operation, could prove it. On April 6, 1973, he was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for the tax evasion conviction. 6 years. At 58 years old, that was a substantial chunk of whatever time he had left. 6 years away from his operations, from his crew, from his family. 6 years during which other ambitious criminals might try to take over his territory. But Paul Vario had been through this before. He'd survived much longer sentences. He knew how to do time. And more importantly, he knew his crew would keep operating in his absence, would keep earning, would keep his businesses running until he could return and reclaim his throne. The federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, became his new home. And what happened there reveals just how corrupt the entire system had become, how deeply organized crime had infiltrated even the institutions designed to punish them. Lewisburg had something called Mafia Row, an entire tier of the prison where connected guys were housed together. And it wasn't like regular prison. These guys lived like kings. They had access to wine, real wine smuggled in by corrupt guards. They had good food, not the standard prison slop, but actual meals prepared by inmates who knew how to cook. They had privileges and comforts that regular prisoners could only dream about. And Paul Vario was right in the middle of it, networking with other mobsters, maintaining his connections, planning for the future. He was sharing that tier with some of the most powerful criminals in America, and they were all looking out for each other, protecting each other, ensuring that even in prison they maintained the hierarchies and relationships that defined their world outside. Henry Hill was at Lewisburg too, serving his own sentence for extortion. The young associate who'd been running errands for Paul Vario since he was a teenager was now doing serious time, and Paul Vario took him under his wing even in prison, protected him, taught him, continued mentoring him in the criminal arts. According to Hill's later testimony, there was even a guy named Johnny Dio, another Lucchese family soldier, who essentially acted as a cook for Paul Vario and the other mobsters on Mafia Row. An informal arrangement where one inmate prepared food for the others, maintaining something approximating the social structures they'd known on the outside. It was supposed to be punishment. It was supposed to be consequences. But for guys like Paul Vario, federal prison was just another location. The game continued. The relationships continued. The business continued through messengers and visitors and corrupt guards who could be bribed to carry messages in and out. Paul Vario spent his time planning, thinking, considering what he'd do when he got out. He'd made mistakes, gotten sloppy, allowed himself to be surveilled and recorded. But he was learning from those mistakes. Next time he'd be more careful, more paranoid, more selective about who he trusted and where he conducted business. He was released in 1975 after serving a little over 2 years of his 6-year sentence. Good behavior, probably, though the idea of Paul Vario being on good behavior in prison is almost laughable. More likely it was overcrowding or legal technicalities or some combination of factors that got him out early. But when he walked out of Lewisburg, things had changed. The Lucchese family had evolved in his absence. There had been a brief period before his incarceration when some thought Paul Vario might become underboss, the number 2 position in the family hierarchy. But that opportunity was gone now. Anthony Corallo had consolidated power. Salvatore Santoro had been installed as underboss. Paul Vario was still a capo, still had his crew, still controlled valuable territory. But the trajectory toward higher leadership was over. He'd peaked, and at 61 years old, he was entering the final phase of his criminal career. The phase where younger guys start circling, start wondering if the old man still has it, start thinking about what happens when he's gone. But Paul Vario wasn't ready to fade away. He still had ambitions, still had the hunger that had driven him since he was a kid in South Brooklyn, still believed he could pull off scores that would cement his legacy in the criminal underworld. An opportunity was about to present itself. The kind of opportunity that comes along maybe once in a lifetime. The kind of score that would either make him a legend or destroy everything he'd spent decades building. But that was still a few years away. For now, in 1975, Paul Vario was just a newly released convict trying to rebuild what he'd lost during his time inside, trying to reassert control over his crew, trying to prove that his arrest and conviction hadn't weakened him, hadn't made him vulnerable, hadn't signaled to the rest of the criminal world that Paul Vario was on his way down. He had money hidden away, had loyal soldiers waiting for his return, had operations that had continued generating income even in his absence. But he also had new problems. The FBI now knew how to get to him. They'd successfully bugged his operations. They'd successfully infiltrated his organization with an undercover officer. They'd successfully prosecuted him and sent him to prison. They could do it again. And next time, they might not make the mistakes that allowed him to get out after just 2 years. Next time, they might build a case so solid, so comprehensive, that even Paul Vario's expensive lawyers couldn't find a way out. He had to be smarter, more careful, more ruthless in eliminating anyone who might become a liability. The paranoia that had always been part of his personality intensified. Everyone was a potential informant. Every conversation might be recorded. Every decision had to account for the possibility that someone was watching, listening, gathering evidence. It was exhausting. It was stressful. It aged him faster than the years alone could account for. But it was also necessary, because Paul Vario understood something fundamental about the life he'd chosen. You don't get to retire from organized crime. You don't get to walk away and live happily ever after. You either die, go to prison forever, or keep playing the game until one of those two outcomes catches up with you. And Paul Vario had no intention of dying or going back to prison. Not yet. Not when there was still money to be made and power to be wielded and scores to be settled. He was back, and Brooklyn was about to remember why they'd feared him in the first place. Chapter 7. Mafia Row. Prison is supposed to break you, supposed to strip away your identity and reduce you to a number in a cell, supposed to make you regret every choice that led you there and convince you to change your ways when you finally get out. But the federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, in the early 1970s wasn't breaking anyone. At least not the connected guys. Not the made men and high-level associates who arrived with the kind of organizational backing that turned incarceration into something closer to a sabbatical. Mafia Row. That's what they called it. An entire tier of the prison where mobsters from various families were housed together, supposedly for security reasons, supposedly to keep them separated from the general population. But what it actually created was a criminal convention center behind bars. A place where the most powerful gangsters in America could network, strategize, and maintain their operations, even while serving federal sentences. Paul Vario arrived at Lewisburg in April of 1973 to serve his 6-year sentence for tax evasion. He was 58 years old enough that 6 years represented a significant portion of whatever time he had left. Old enough that most men would be thinking about mortality, about legacy, about whether the life they'd chosen was worth the price they were paying. But Paul Vario wasn't most men. He walked into Lewisburg like he was checking into a hotel. His reputation preceded him. The other inmates knew who he was, what he'd done, what he was capable of doing. And on Mafia Row, reputation was currency. The living conditions would have shocked anyone who believed in the concept of punishment. These weren't Spartan cells with thin mattresses and terrible food. Well, technically they were. But the mobsters on Mafia Row had transformed their environment into something remarkably comfortable through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and the kind of organizational skills that had made them successful criminals in the first place. Wine flowed on Mafia Row. Real wine, not prison hooch fermented in toilets. Someone, probably multiple someones, was smuggling bottles in. Guards on the take looked the other way. Money changed hands. And the result was that Paul Vario and his fellow inmates could enjoy a glass of wine with dinner like civilized men instead of convicted felons. The food was another revelation. Prison cafeteria food is notoriously terrible, designed more for cost efficiency than palatability. But on Mafia Row, someone was cooking real meals. According to Henry Hill, who spent time on that same tier, there was an inmate named Johnny Dio, a Lucchese family soldier, who essentially acted as personal chef for Paul Vario and the other high-ranking mobsters. Johnny Dio would prepare actual Italian meals. Pasta with real sauce, meat that hadn't been processed into unrecognizable shapes, vegetables that weren't boiled into submission. It was a complete mockery of the concept of punishment, a demonstration that even in federal prison, money and connections could buy you comfort. And Paul Vario lived like royalty. Compared to regular prisoners eating mystery meat and sleeping on thin mattresses and living in constant fear of violence, Mafia Row was paradise. These guys had respect, had protection, had a social structure that replicated the hierarchies they'd known on the outside. Henry Hill was there too, serving a 10-year sentence for extortion. The young associate who'd been running errands for Paul Vario since his teenage years was now experiencing prison alongside his mentor. And their relationship deepened during those shared months at Lewisburg. Paul Vario took care of Henry, made sure he was protected, made sure he understood how to navigate the prison system, made sure he had access to the same privileges that Paul Vario enjoyed. It was mentorship in the purest form, an older gangster teaching a younger one how to survive, how to thrive, even in circumstances that should have been purely punitive. They spent hours talking, planning, discussing business on the outside, operations that were continuing in their absence, opportunities that would be waiting when they got out. Prison didn't stop the mob. It just relocated some of the planning sessions. And Paul Vario was using his time inside to strengthen his network. The other mobsters on Mafia Row came from different families, controlled different territories, had different specialties. But they were all part of the same world, all playing the same game. And relationships formed in prison could be valuable on the outside. You do time with someone, you share meals with them, you face the daily degradation of incarceration together, and a bond forms. A sense of mutual respect, an understanding that you've both survived something difficult. And in the mob, those bonds translate into business relationships, into mutual support, into the kind of alliances that can be profitable for everyone involved. But something else was happening during Paul Vario's time at Lewisburg, something that wouldn't become clear until much later. Henry Hill's wife, Karen, was alone on the outside. Her husband was in prison. Money was tight. The life she'd become accustomed to, the mob wife lifestyle with its perks and privileges, was suddenly unavailable. And Paul Vario, the man who'd always presented himself as a protector, as a father figure, as someone who looked after his people, allegedly had an affair with her, with his protégé's wife. While Henry was locked up, while he was vulnerable, while he had no way of knowing what was happening back home, Paul Vario had arranged the execution of one of his own men, had used information as a weapon, had demonstrated that loyalty only flowed one direction in his world. You were loyal to Paul Vario. But Paul Vario was loyal only to Paul Vario. Henry Hill remained in Lewisburg for most of his sentence, unaware that his boss was sleeping with his wife, unaware that Tommy DeSimone's fate was being sealed by conversations and agreements happening behind the scenes. He just kept doing his time, kept believing in the family, kept trusting that Paul Vario would take care of him the way he'd always taken care of him. But Paul Vario got out first. He was released in 1975 after serving just over 2 years of his 6-year sentence. Good behavior and overcrowding and the mysterious mechanisms of the federal prison system combined to set him free much earlier than expected. He walked out of Lewisburg and back into a world that had continued evolving without him. His crew had kept operating, kept earning, kept his seat warm. But things had shifted. Power dynamics had changed. And Paul Vario had to reassert himself, had to prove he was still the same dangerous, effective criminal he'd been before his incarceration. The affair with Karen Hill apparently continued after his release, though the exact timeline is unclear. What is clear is that Henry Hill remained in prison, remained unaware, remained loyal to the man who was betraying him in the most fundamental way possible. And Paul Vario maintained his facade, the wise boss, the protector, the father figure who looked after his people and maintained the code. It was all a lie, but it was a lie that people wanted to believe, because the alternative was admitting that the entire structure of organized crime, with all its talk of honor and respect and loyalty, was just a thin veneer over predatory behavior. Paul Vario was also dealing with new realities on the outside. The FBI hadn't forgotten about him. They'd successfully prosecuted him once, and they could do it again. He had to be more careful now, more paranoid, more selective about who he trusted and where he conducted business. He reconnected with his crew. Jimmy Burke was still out there, still hijacking trucks, still earning. The airport operations were still running. The loan sharking and bookmaking and all the other rackets that generated steady income were still functioning. Paul Vario slipped back into his role like he'd never left. But he was also keeping secrets now. Secrets about Karen Hill. Secrets about his role in Tommy DeSimone's murder. Secrets about deals he'd made and alliances he'd formed while inside. And secrets have a way of festering, of creating complications, of eventually exploding into disasters that destroy everything you've built. The FBI had also developed new sources of information during Paul Vario's absence. They'd been monitoring his crew, building relationships with potential informants, gathering evidence for future prosecutions. They were patient. They understood that bringing down someone like Paul Vario required time and careful preparation. And Paul Vario was entering a dangerous phase of his criminal career. He was 61 years old when he got out of Lewisburg. Not old by normal standards, but old for someone in his line of work. The physical toll of violence and stress and incarceration was adding up. And younger guys were watching, wondering when the old man would slip, when opportunities might open up for advancement. He had to stay sharp, had to stay ruthless, had to keep proving that age hadn't softened him, hadn't made him vulnerable, hadn't reduced his capacity for the kind of violence that kept people in line. And he also had to deal with financial pressure. His time in prison had disrupted his income streams. Legal fees for his defense had been substantial. He needed money, needed a score that would replenish his reserves and demonstrate that he was still a major player in the New York underworld. That financial pressure would soon connect with opportunity in a way that would change everything. But for now, in 1975, Paul Vario was just trying to rebuild, trying to reclaim the power and territory he'd temporarily surrendered, trying to navigate a world that had continued spinning while he was locked away. He maintained his legitimate business fronts: the flower shop, the taxi stand, the restaurant, places where money could be laundered, where meetings could happen, where the business of organized crime could be conducted with a veneer of respectability. And he maintained his iron grip on his crew. Nobody questioned his authority. Nobody challenged his decisions. Because everyone remembered what happened to people who crossed Paul Vario. Everyone understood that age hadn't mellowed him, hadn't reduced his willingness to hurt anyone who threatened his position. Henry Hill was released from prison eventually, his sentence reduced through various legal mechanisms. And he came back to find a world that had changed in subtle ways he didn't fully understand. His wife was different. His relationship with Paul Vario felt different. The crew had new dynamics that had developed in his absence. But he didn't know the truth. Didn't know about the affair. Didn't know about Paul Vario's role in Tommy DeSimone's death. He just knew that something felt off, that the family he believed in wasn't quite what he'd thought it was. The bonds formed on Mafia Row, the loyalty tested in federal prison, the mentorship that had sustained both Paul Vario and Henry Hill during their incarceration, all of it was built on lies and betrayals and secrets that would eventually tear everything apart. But for now, they maintained the fiction, maintained the code, maintained the illusion that they were all part of something noble, something honorable, something worth the sacrifices they'd made. Paul Vario was free. He was back in control. He had survived another stint in prison and emerged with his power intact. The king had returned to his kingdom, and Brooklyn remembered why they'd feared him. Everything seemed to be returning to normal. The operations were running smoothly. The money was flowing. The respect was being paid. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Relationships were damaged. Trust was eroding. And the seeds of the ultimate betrayal were already planted, just waiting for the right conditions to sprout and destroy everything Paul Vario had spent his life building. The details are murky because nobody involved was eager to advertise this particular betrayal. But according to later testimony and accounts from people close to the situation, Paul Vario and Karen Hill became intimately involved during Henry's incarceration. It was a profound violation of the code that mobsters claim to live by. You don't touch another man's wife, especially not when that man is locked up and can't defend what's his. But Paul Vario apparently didn't care about that rule when it conflicted with what he wanted. And what he wanted was Karen Hill. So he took her, used his power and influence to seduce or coerce or simply take advantage of a woman whose husband was in prison and who needed support. It reveals something ugly about Paul Vario's character, something beyond the criminal violence and the business ruthlessness, a willingness to betray the people closest to him, the people who depended on him, the people who'd given him their loyalty and trust. For all his talk about honor and respect and the code, Paul Vario was perfectly willing to discard those values when they became inconvenient. And there's something even darker that happened during this period. Tommy DeSimone, the psychotic enforcer in Paul Vario's crew, allegedly tried to rape Karen Hill. Not allegedly in the sense that there's doubt about whether it happened, but allegedly in the sense that it was never prosecuted, never officially documented, just another crime that occurred in the shadows where Paul Vario operated. Tommy DeSimone was a monster. Everyone who knew him understood that. He killed people for minor slights. He had no impulse control, no sense of boundaries, no understanding that some lines shouldn't be crossed. And apparently he decided that Karen Hill, the wife of his fellow crew member, was fair game. What happened next reveals the twisted logic of mob justice. Paul Vario didn't punish Tommy DeSimone, didn't have him beaten or killed or expelled from the crew. Instead, Paul Vario allegedly made a phone call. He called the Gambino crime family and informed them that Tommy DeSimone was responsible for killing 2 of their men. One of those men was Billy Batts, a made guy in the Gambino family. DeSimone had killed him years earlier in a drunken rage, beaten him to death over some perceived insult. The Gambino family had suspected DeSimone but couldn't prove it. Now Paul Vario was confirming their suspicions and essentially giving them permission to take revenge. Why would Paul Vario do that? Why would he sacrifice one of his own crew members, someone who'd been earning for him and killing for him for years? Maybe it was about Karen Hill. Maybe Paul Vario was protecting her, eliminating the threat that Tommy DeSimone represented. Or maybe it was more calculated than that. Maybe DeSimone had become too unpredictable, too dangerous, too likely to draw law enforcement attention with his reckless violence. Maybe Paul Vario saw an opportunity to solve a problem while simultaneously doing the Gambino family a favor, building goodwill that could be useful later. Whatever his reasoning, the result was clear. In January of 1979, Tommy DeSimone disappeared. He was supposedly being taken to a ceremony where he'd be made, where he'd become a full member of the Lucchese family. Instead, he was taken to a location where Gambino family members were waiting, and they killed him, shot him multiple times. His body was never found. Chapter 8. The Lufthansa Green Light. Desperation makes men reckless. And in 1978, Paul Vario was desperate. On the surface, everything looked fine. His crew was operating. His territory was secure. The rackets were generating income. But beneath that facade, Paul Vario had a serious problem. He'd lost a major cocaine shipment to the authorities. Not just a few kilos. We're talking about 30 tons of cocaine seized by the DEA in Queens. 30 tons with an estimated street value of $1.5 million. And Paul Vario had financed that shipment, had fronted the money with the expectation of massive returns, had made promises to other mobsters, to partners in the deal, to people you don't want to disappoint. Now that shipment was sitting in an evidence locker instead of being sold on the streets of New York, and Paul Vario was on the hook for money he didn't have. This was the kind of problem that got people killed, the kind of problem that could destroy a reputation built over decades. Paul Vario needed cash. Fast. A lot of it. And he needed it from a source that couldn't be traced back to the failed cocaine deal, that wouldn't raise questions about why a supposedly successful mob boss suddenly needed an influx of money. Then Louis Werner walked into his life. Or more accurately, Louis Werner walked into a bookmaker's life. And that bookmaker knew exactly who to talk to. Werner was a cargo supervisor at Lufthansa Airlines, working at John F. Kennedy International Airport, the same airport Paul Vario had been exploiting for years. Werner had a gambling problem. The kind of problem that starts with friendly bets and escalates into crushing debt that follows you everywhere, that wakes you up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, that makes you consider options you never would have considered before. He owed $20,000 to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman, $20,000 he didn't have and couldn't pay. And Krugman, who ran a wig shop as a front for his bookmaking operation, was starting to apply pressure, starting to make it clear that unpaid gambling debts have consequences. But Werner had something valuable. He had information. He knew the layout of the Lufthansa cargo facility. He knew the security protocols. He knew the shift schedules. And most importantly, he knew that massive amounts of untraceable cash regularly arrived from Germany and sat in a vault over the weekend before being transferred to banks on Monday morning. Millions of dollars. Just sitting there. Protected by security that Werner knew was inadequate. Protected by systems that could be bypassed if you had inside information and the right crew to execute the job. Werner approached Krugman with a proposition. He'd provide the inside information necessary to rob the Lufthansa cargo facility if Krugman could find people capable of pulling off the heist. And Krugman, who was well connected in the criminal underworld, knew exactly who to approach. He went to Henry Hill, and Henry Hill went to Jimmy Burke. And Jimmy Burke, the brilliant hijacker and ruthless killer who'd been part of Paul Vario's crew for years, started planning what would become the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. But Burke couldn't move forward without permission. This was Paul Vario's territory. The airport belonged to him in every way that mattered. Running a major heist at JFK without Paul Vario's approval would be suicide, would be a direct challenge to his authority that would result in everyone involved getting killed. So Burke brought the plan to Paul Vario, laid out the opportunity, explained the inside information they had, detailed how the job could be done with minimal risk if they moved quickly and professionally. And Paul Vario, desperate for cash, saw his salvation, saw a way to recover from the cocaine disaster, saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up. He gave his approval, green-lighted the operation, and with that decision, he set in motion events that would eventually destroy his entire organization. The planning happened at Robert's Lounge, Jimmy Burke's bar in the Ozone Park section of Queens, a dingy place where criminals gathered to drink and scheme and plan their next scores. Burke and Hill pored over floor plans of the cargo facility, studied the security systems, analyzed the shift schedules, identified vulnerabilities, and planned contingencies. They assembled a crew, not a huge team, just enough guys to handle the physical execution of the robbery while maintaining operational security. Tommy DeSimone was supposed to be part of it, but he'd already disappeared by then, already been killed on Paul Vario's orders. So they brought in others: Angelo Sepe, Louis Caffra, Joe Manry, Paolo Licastri, Robert McMahon. Burke's son Frank would drive one of the getaway vehicles, and Parnell Edwards, known as Stax, would dispose of the van afterward. Each participant was promised a cut based on their role, $10,000 to $50,000 per person, calculated on an estimated take of $2 million. Nobody knew yet that the actual haul would be nearly 3 times that amount. Nobody understood the magnitude of what they were about to pull off. The planning was meticulous. Burke was brilliant at this kind of thing, had been hijacking trucks and robbing cargo facilities for years. He knew how to minimize risk, how to control variables, how to ensure that everyone understood their role and executed it perfectly. And then they waited for Werner to confirm that a large shipment had arrived, waited for the perfect moment when maximum cash would be sitting in that vault with minimum security protecting it. The call came on December 9th, 1978, a Saturday. Werner confirmed that a large shipment of cash had arrived on Friday and would be sitting in the cargo facility all weekend. The money was there. The opportunity was now. Paul Vario waited in the background. He wasn't going to be anywhere near the actual robbery. That's not how bosses operate. They insulate themselves, maintain plausible deniability, ensure that even if everything goes wrong, there's no direct evidence connecting them to the crime. But he was watching, waiting, counting on this score to solve his financial problems. At 3:12 in the morning on Monday, December 11th, 1978, a black Ford Econoline van pulled up to the Lufthansa cargo facility. 6 men in ski masks emerged. They cut the lock with bolt cutters. They entered the building using a key Werner had provided. The night shift manager, Rudy Eyrich, was the key to the whole operation. He was the only one who could open the double-locked doors to the vault without triggering alarms. The crew forced him at gunpoint to come downstairs, to deactivate the security system, to open the doors. Eyrich cooperated. What choice did he have? A gun in your face at 3 in the morning tends to make compliance seem like the smart option. He opened the vault, and what the crew found inside exceeded their wildest expectations. 40 cartons, each one weighing 15 pounds, packed with cash and jewelry. They loaded everything into the van, methodically, professionally. No panic, no mistakes, just cold execution of a carefully planned operation. The total time inside the building was 64 minutes. Nobody was seriously hurt. No shots were fired. It was a textbook robbery, the kind that crews dream about. Clean, efficient, massively profitable. They told the Lufthansa staff to wait 15 minutes before calling police. And the staff complied. Waited exactly 15 minutes before reporting the robbery, giving the crew time to disappear into the Brooklyn night. By the time law enforcement responded, the van was gone. The crew was scattered, and $5.8 million in cash and jewelry had vanished. $5.8 million. The largest cash robbery in American history at that time. A score so big, so audacious, so perfectly executed that it immediately became legendary in criminal circles. And Paul Vario's cut would be substantial. As the boss who controlled the territory and greenlit the operation, he'd receive a significant tribute payment. Not the biggest share, that would go to Burke, who planned and executed the job, but enough to solve his financial problems. Enough to recover from the cocaine disaster. Enough to prove he was still a major player in the New York underworld. Henry Hill later claimed that Paul Vario showed him a vault that supposedly contained over $1 million in cash. Just sitting there. Paul Vario's personal reserve, his cushion against future problems, his proof that the Lufthansa heist had been a massive success. For a few brief weeks, everything seemed perfect. The heist had worked exactly as planned. The money was being divided up and laundered. Law enforcement was scrambling, but had no solid leads. The crew had pulled off something that would be remembered for decades. But success brings its own problems, especially when you're dealing with criminals who suddenly have access to more money than they've ever seen in their lives. The agreement after the heist was clear. Everyone needed to lay low. Don't spend extravagantly. Don't attract attention. Don't do anything that might draw law enforcement scrutiny. Just sit on the money for a while, let the heat die down, and then gradually, carefully, begin enjoying the proceeds. It was smart advice, the kind of cautious, strategic thinking that keeps criminals out of prison. But not everyone followed it. Some crew members immediately started spending, buying new cars, taking expensive vacations, purchasing jewelry and fur coats, and all the visible markers of sudden wealth. And in neighborhoods where most people struggled to pay rent, that kind of conspicuous consumption attracted attention. The FBI identified the Burke crew as likely perpetrators within 3 days of the robbery. They found the van, burned and abandoned in Canarsie, and traced it back to a Queens auto repair shop with connections to organized crime. They knew who did it. They just couldn't prove it yet. Burke started getting paranoid, started worrying that loose ends would unravel the whole operation, started calculating which crew members might become liabilities. And Jimmy Burke's solution to liability problems was always the same. Kill them. Kill everyone who might talk. Kill them before they had a chance to cooperate with authorities. And keep the money for himself in the process. Paul Vario watched all of this unfold from his usual position of calculated distance. He'd gotten his cut. He'd solved his immediate financial crisis. But he also understood that Burke's paranoia was justified. The heist had been too big, too public, too successful. Law enforcement wouldn't give up. They'd keep investigating, keep applying pressure, keep looking for someone weak enough to crack. And in a crew full of criminals who'd suddenly become millionaires, someone would eventually crack. The first to die was Parnell Edwards, just 7 days after the heist. Stacks had one job: take the getaway van to a Gotti-controlled junkyard and have it destroyed. Simple. Crucial. The van was evidence. It had fingerprints, fibers, DNA, everything law enforcement needed to build a case. But Stacks got high, got distracted, parked the van on a street in Brooklyn, and forgot about it. And when the van was discovered, when Burke realized that this one simple task had been botched, he ordered Edwards killed. Paul Vario gave his blessing. Lucchese Capo approving the execution of someone who'd endangered the entire operation. Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe went to Edwards' apartment and shot him 5 times in the head. December 18, 1978. The Lufthansa bodies were beginning to pile up. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who'd brought the opportunity to Henry Hill in the first place, started complaining. He wanted a bigger cut, wanted what he believed he was owed, started making noise about how he deserved more money for setting up the score. Burke couldn't have that. Couldn't have someone drawing attention to themselves, making demands, potentially becoming a squeaky wheel that law enforcement could exploit. So in January of 1979, according to Hill's testimony, Burke and Sepe killed and dismembered Krugman. His body was never found. The money that was supposed to solve Paul Vario's problems was becoming a bloodbath. And Paul Vario, who'd spent decades avoiding the kind of heat that came with high-profile crimes, was now connected to the biggest robbery in American history and the murders that followed. He'd needed cash desperately. He'd gotten it. But the cost was starting to look like it might be everything he'd built. The FBI was circling. Bodies were dropping. And somewhere in that crew, someone was eventually going to decide that cooperation looked better than a bullet in the head. Paul Vario had approved the Lufthansa Heist thinking it would save him. Instead, he'd signed his own death warrant. He just didn't know it yet. For now, he had his money, had his vault full of cash, had the satisfaction of knowing he'd been part of something legendary. He'd gambled everything on one big score, and he'd won. But in the mob, winning often looks a lot like losing. You just don't realize it until it's too late to do anything about it. Paul Vario was 64 years old. He had money and power and respect. He'd survived poverty, prison, betrayal, and law enforcement investigations. He'd built an empire and maintained it through violence and cunning. And he had no idea that his empire was about to crumble. That the heist he'd approved would be the beginning of the end. That the money in his vault was blood money in more ways than one. He just kept operating, kept collecting his tribute payments, kept believing he was untouchable, kept playing the game the way he'd always played it, with ruthlessness, with calculation, with absolute confidence that he was smarter than everyone trying to bring him down. He'd been wrong about a lot of things in his life, but he'd never been more wrong than he was about that. Chapter 9. The bloodbath begins. The money was cursed from the moment it left that vault. Jimmy Burke had pulled off the impossible. $5.8 million. The biggest cash robbery in American history. A score that should have set everyone up for life. Should have been the crowning achievement of a criminal career. Should have meant comfortable retirement, or at least the kind of financial cushion that makes everything easier. Instead, it became a death sentence for almost everyone involved. Burke's paranoia wasn't irrational. The FBI had identified his crew within 72 hours of the heist. They were conducting surveillance, following crew members, building a case. And Burke understood something fundamental about criminal prosecutions. They don't need to catch you in the act. They just need one person to talk. One person to decide that 20 years in prison sounds worse than cooperation and witness protection. So Burke decided that nobody would get the chance to talk. He'd eliminate the weak links, take their shares of the money for himself, and sleep soundly knowing that dead men don't testify. The killing had started with Pernell Edwards. Stacks, the guy who was supposed to dispose of the getaway van and failed. His execution 7 days after the heist was justified, in Burke's twisted logic, as necessary operational security. You can't leave evidence sitting on a Brooklyn street. You can't let incompetence endanger the entire crew. But Edwards' murder set a precedent, established that Burke was willing to kill members of his own crew. And once that line was crossed, once the first body dropped, it became easier to justify the next one, and the next one, and the one after that. Martin Krugman was next, the bookmaker who'd brought the Lufthansa opportunity to Henry Hill in the first place. Krugman should have been celebrating, should have been enjoying his cut of the biggest score any of them had ever pulled. Instead, he made a fatal mistake. He complained, loudly and frequently. He wanted more money, believed he deserved a bigger share for setting up the heist. He didn't understand that in Jimmy Burke's world, complaining about money was the same as signing your own death warrant. Burke couldn't have someone drawing attention to themselves, making noise, potentially attracting law enforcement scrutiny. So in January of 1979, according to Henry Hill's later testimony, Burke and Angelo Sepe killed Krugman and dismembered his body. They didn't just shoot him and leave him somewhere to be found. They took him apart, made him disappear so completely that no body was ever recovered, no funeral was ever held, no grave was ever marked. Martin Krugman simply ceased to exist except in the memories of the people who knew what happened. And Paul Vario knew. Had to know. You don't conduct that level of violence in his territory without his knowledge and approval. He was the capo, the boss. Everything that happened in his crew required his blessing, explicit or implicit. So when crew members started disappearing, when the bodies started piling up, Paul Vario was complicit. Maybe he didn't pull the triggers himself. Maybe he maintained his usual distance, his careful insulation from the actual violence. But he approved it, allowed it, understood it was necessary to protect the larger operation. The problem was that Burke couldn't stop. The paranoia was feeding on itself, growing, metastasizing into something beyond rational calculation. Anyone who might talk became a target. Anyone who participated in the heist became a liability. Anyone who knew too much, or talked too much, or spent too conspicuously became marked for death. Louis Caffra and his wife Joanna disappeared in March of 1979. Caffra had been part of the heist crew, had earned his share, and then apparently made the mistake of being too visible or too loose-lipped or simply too alive for Burke's comfort. He and his wife were killed, and their bodies disappeared. Never found, never properly mourned, just erased from existence. Tommy DeSimone should have been next on the list based purely on his involvement in the heist. But Tommy's death had nothing to do with Lufthansa, at least not directly. That had been arranged earlier, orchestrated by Paul Vario for reasons that had more to do with Karen Hill and old debts to the Gambino family than with the robbery. In January of 1979, Tommy was told he was going to be made, going to become a full member of the Lucchese crime family. It was supposed to be the greatest honor a mob associate could receive, the culmination of years of violence and loyalty and earning. Tommy got dressed up, got in a car with people he trusted, and was driven to his execution. The Gambino family was waiting. They shot him multiple times and disposed of his body so thoroughly that it was never recovered. And Tommy DeSimone, the psychotic killer who'd murdered Billy Batts and God knows how many other people, simply disappeared. Paul Vario had set it up, had confirmed to the Gambinos that Tommy was responsible for killing two of their men, had essentially given them permission and opportunity to take their revenge. Whether it was about protecting Karen Hill from Tommy's assault or simply eliminating a liability who'd become too unpredictable, the result was the same. Tommy was dead, and Paul Vario had his blood on his hands. But the Lufthansa murders continued. Paolo Licastri disappeared. Robert McMahon disappeared. Joe Manry disappeared. One by one, the crew that had pulled off the heist of the century was being systematically eliminated, their shares of the money reverting to Jimmy Burke, their potential testimony being permanently silenced. The FBI watched it happen, documented the disappearances, built timelines connecting the victims to the Lufthansa heist. But watching isn't the same as preventing. And without witnesses, without bodies, without evidence that would hold up in court, they couldn't stop the killing spree. Henry Hill watched it happen too, watched his friends and associates disappear, watched Burke's paranoia consume everyone around him, and started to realize that he might be next, that all his years of loyalty, all his work for Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke, might not be enough to save him when Burke decided that Henry knew too much. But Henry had another problem, a problem that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the Lufthansa fallout. He'd gotten heavily involved in drug trafficking, had built his own operation, moving cocaine and marijuana, had recruited other members of the crew to work with him, and he'd done it all without Paul Vario's explicit permission. Paul Vario had made his position on drugs clear. He didn't want his crew involved in narcotics trafficking, not because of any moral objection. Paul Vario had no morals, but because drug cases brought federal attention, carried mandatory minimum sentences, and provided prosecutors with leverage to flip defendants into cooperating witnesses. You get caught with drugs, you're facing 20 years minimum, and 20 years is a long time. Long enough that cooperation starts looking attractive. Long enough that the code of silence starts to crack. Long enough that even loyal soldiers consider trading information for reduced sentences. Paul Vario understood this, understood that drug trafficking was a threat to his entire organization. So he'd warned Henry explicitly, stay away from drugs. Don't get involved in that business. Focus on the traditional rackets that we've always run. But Henry didn't listen. The money from drugs was too good. The margins were too attractive. The demand was insatiable. He built his own network, moved product, made huge amounts of money, and thought he could keep it secret from Paul Vario. He was wrong. Paul Vario found out. And when he found out, his response was measured but chilling. He warned Henry one more time. Told him that if he continued dealing drugs, if he got arrested for narcotics, Paul Vario wouldn't protect him, wouldn't provide lawyers, wouldn't send money to his family. Henry would be on his own. It was a death sentence disguised as a warning. Because without the protection of the family, without the resources and connections that came with being part of Paul Vario's crew, Henry Hill was just another criminal facing decades in federal prison with no options except to cooperate or die behind bars. But Henry couldn't stop. The addiction wasn't to drugs. It was to money, to the lifestyle, to the rush of moving product and watching cash pile up. He kept dealing, kept building his operation, kept ignoring the warnings that should have been impossible to ignore. And Paul Vario watched, waited, planned for the inevitable moment when Henry's drug operation would collapse and create problems that would threaten everything. Meanwhile, the Lufthansa investigation was intensifying. The FBI had installed surveillance equipment everywhere. They were following crew members 24 hours a day using helicopters and multiple car teams. They were bugging phones at Robert's Lounge and monitoring payphones near the bar. They were collecting evidence, building cases, waiting for someone to make a mistake big enough to provide the opening they needed. They recorded fragments of conversations. Angelo Seppe telling an unidentified man about a brown case and a bag from Lufthansa. Seppe telling his girlfriend he wanted to see where the money was at. Nothing definitive enough to prosecute, but enough to confirm they were on the right track. The pressure was immense. Constant surveillance. Friends and associates disappearing. The knowledge that any mistake, any slip, any moment of carelessness could result in arrest or death. It was the kind of pressure that breaks people, that makes them consider options they never would have considered before. Henry Hill started using cocaine, not dealing it exclusively, but using it, self-medicating against the stress and paranoia. And cocaine makes you sloppy, makes you take risks, makes you think you're invincible when you're actually at your most vulnerable. On May 11th, 1978, months before the Lufthansa heist even happened, Henry had been arrested for fixing basketball games at Boston College. It was part of a point-shaving scheme that Jimmy Burke had organized. Players were paid to keep games within certain point spreads, allowing connected gamblers to win big on bets they knew were rigged. Henry had been involved, had helped coordinate payments to players. And when the scheme unraveled, he was arrested and charged. But that case was separate from Lufthansa, separate from the drug trafficking, just another thread in the increasingly tangled web of Henry Hill's criminal career. He'd posted bail, continued operating, continued believing that somehow he'd navigate through all these problems and come out the other side intact. But the walls were closing in from multiple directions. The Lufthansa investigation, the basketball fixing case, his own drug operation, and Jimmy Burke's paranoia. Paul Vario was watching all of this unfold, watching Henry spiral, watching Burke kill off crew members, watching the FBI tighten their net. And Paul Vario, who'd spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of heat, was trapped in the middle of it. He'd approved the Lufthansa heist because he needed money. That decision had seemed smart at the time, necessary even. But now it was becoming clear that the heist had created more problems than it solved. The money was great. The notoriety was terrible. And the body count was drawing exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that Paul Vario had spent his entire career trying to avoid. He couldn't control Jimmy Burke's killing spree, couldn't stop the FBI investigation, couldn't make Henry Hill stop dealing drugs. All he could do was try to maintain distance, try to insulate himself from the chaos, try to ensure that when everything inevitably collapsed, he wouldn't be buried in the rubble. But it was too late for that. He was already implicated, already connected, already marked as a target by law enforcement agencies that had been trying to bring him down for decades, and finally saw their opportunity. The FBI had recordings of Burke and Vario discussing the possibility of killing Henry Hill, discussing how Henry had become a problem that needed to be solved. The recordings weren't clear enough to prosecute, but they were clear enough that when played for Henry, they'd convince him that his life was in danger from the very people he'd spent years working for. And Paul Vario had participated in those discussions, had agreed that Henry was a liability, had given his implicit approval for Burke to handle the situation however he saw fit. He was trying to eliminate problems before they became catastrophic, trying to clean up the mess that the Lufthansa Heist had created, trying to survive. But in trying to survive, he was creating the conditions for his own destruction. Because every person he eliminated, every witness Burke killed, every crime he committed trying to cover up previous crimes, all of it was just adding to the case that law enforcement was building against him. It's the classic criminal spiral. You commit a crime. Then you commit more crimes to cover up the first crime. Then you commit even more crimes to cover up the cover-up. And eventually the weight of it all becomes impossible to sustain. Eventually something breaks. Eventually someone talks. By late 1979, Paul Vario's empire was rotting from the inside. The Lufthansa money had bought him temporary relief from his financial problems, but it had also bought him federal scrutiny, multiple murder investigations, and a crew that was disintegrating through violence and paranoia. He was 65 years old, should have been thinking about retirement, about enjoying the money he'd accumulated over decades of crime. Instead, he was managing a crisis that grew worse every day, managing killings and investigations, and the slow, inevitable collapse of everything he'd built. The bodies kept appearing, or rather, kept not appearing, kept being disappeared so thoroughly that families held funerals without caskets, mourned losses without closure, lived with the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones. And through it all, Paul Vario maintained his facade. The calm boss, the calculating strategist, the man who was always 3 moves ahead. But behind that facade, he had to be afraid, had to understand that the odds were turning against him, had to know that the empire he'd spent his life building was crumbling. The Lufthansa Heist should have been his crowning achievement. Instead, it was becoming his epitaph, the score that would be remembered long after he was gone, the crime that would define his legacy, and the decision that would ultimately destroy him. He'd approved the heist thinking it would solve his problems, but all it had done was create new ones. Worse ones. The kind of problems that end with everyone dead or in prison. The kind of problems that even someone as experienced and ruthless as Paul Vario couldn't solve through violence or intimidation or careful planning. The bloodbath had begun, and it wouldn't end until there was nobody left to kill, until the entire crew that had pulled off the greatest robbery in American history had been eliminated or imprisoned, until everything Paul Vario had built collapsed into blood and testimony and federal indictments. But that was still ahead. For now, in late 1979, Paul Vario was just trying to survive one more day, trying to stay ahead of the FBI, trying to keep his crew from completely falling apart, trying to believe that somehow, impossibly, he could still come out of this intact. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. Didn't know that the final betrayal was coming. Didn't know that his protege, the kid he'd mentored since he was a teenager, was about to make a decision that would bring down the entire organization. All Paul Vario knew was that the game had changed, that the rules he'd lived by for 65 years weren't working anymore, that the world was shifting beneath his feet, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chapter 10. The Empire Crumbles. April 11th, 1980. The day everything Paul Vario built began to collapse. Henry Hill was arrested at his home in Nassau County on drug trafficking charges. Not hypothetically, not as part of some minor bust that could be handled with a good lawyer and a few $1,000s. This was serious. Federal charges. Cocaine and marijuana trafficking. The kind of case that carried mandatory minimum sentences measured in decades, not years. The police had been watching him for months, building their case, documenting his drug operation with the same methodical patience they'd used trying to connect him to Lufthansa. They had surveillance footage. They had recorded conversations. They had evidence that would be nearly impossible to challenge in court. Henry Hill was looking at 20 years minimum in federal prison. 20 years that would turn him from a 40-year-old criminal into a 60-year-old ex-convict with no prospects and no future. 20 years during which his children would grow up without him. 20 years of wondering every single day if Jimmy Burke had finally decided to have him killed. Because that was the other problem. The drug arrest wasn't happening in isolation. It was happening while bodies from the Lufthansa crew continued to disappear, while Burke's paranoia continued to escalate, while the FBI continued to tighten their surveillance and their pressure. Henry sat in a cell and did the math. If he stayed loyal, if he kept his mouth shut and followed the code he'd been raised with since he was a teenager, he'd go to prison for 20 years. And there was a very real possibility he wouldn't survive those 20 years. Burke had connections inside. Burke could reach him anywhere. A shank in the prison yard, poison in his food, a setup that would make his death look like a gang dispute or an accident. But if he cooperated, if he told the FBI everything he knew, he could get a reduced sentence, could enter witness protection, could take his family somewhere far away where Burke and Vario couldn't touch them, could actually survive. It wasn't an easy choice. Everything in his upbringing, everything in his criminal career, everything in the culture of Omerta he'd been steeped in told him that cooperation was unforgivable, that talking to the FBI made you a rat, that rats deserved whatever happened to them. But survival has a way of overriding principle. And Henry Hill wanted to survive. The FBI approached him, not immediately after his arrest. They let him sit for a while, let him think, let the reality of his situation fully sink in. Let him imagine those 20 years stretching out in front of him. Imagine his family visiting him in prison. Imagine growing old behind bars while everyone he'd known either died or moved on with their lives. Then they made their offer. Full cooperation in exchange for witness protection. Tell us everything you know about Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, the Lufthansa Heist, and every other crime you've been involved in or witnessed. Give us testimony that will hold up in court. Help us build cases that will actually result in convictions. And we'll keep you alive. We'll relocate you and your family. Give you new identities. A chance to start over somewhere far from New York, far from the mob, far from everyone who'd want you dead for talking. But before Henry could even consider that offer, the FBI played him something that made his decision much easier. They played him recordings. Conversations they'd captured through surveillance. Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke discussing what to do about the Henry Hill problem. Henry listened to his mentor, the man who'd been like a father to him, casually discussing whether he should be killed. Listen to Burke, his partner in countless crimes, weighing the pros and cons of having him murdered. Listen to them talk about him like he was a business problem to be solved rather than a human being they'd worked with for decades. The conversations weren't explicit enough to be used as evidence in a murder conspiracy case, but they were explicit enough to convince Henry that his loyalty meant nothing, that all his years of service, all his crimes, all his earnings, all his dedication to the life had bought him exactly nothing when it came to his own survival. Paul Vario wasn't going to protect him, wasn't going to provide lawyers or send money to his family, or do any of the things a boss is supposed to do for a loyal soldier who gets jammed up. No, Paul Vario had written him off the moment he got arrested on drug charges, had decided Henry was a liability, had given Burke implicit permission to solve that liability permanently. And Jimmy Burke, the man Henry had pulled jobs with for years, the man he'd trusted with his life on countless occasions, was actively planning his murder, was probably just waiting for the right opportunity, the right moment when Henry would be vulnerable. So Henry Hill made a choice. On that level, it wasn't even really a choice. It was survival instinct overriding everything else. He agreed to cooperate, agreed to tell the FBI everything he knew, agreed to testify in court against the men who'd been planning to kill him. And with that agreement, Henry Hill became the most valuable informant the FBI had ever developed in their investigation of the Lucchese crime family. He started talking, and what he told them was extraordinary in its scope and detail. Decades of crimes, murders, robberies, hijackings, loan sharking operations, gambling rackets, drug trafficking, point-shaving schemes, every illegal enterprise Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke had been involved in. Henry had seen it all, participated in most of it, and now he was documenting it for federal prosecutors. He gave them Paul Vario, gave them details about his operations at the airport, his control over unions, his approval of the Lufthansa Heist, his involvement in various murders. He gave them Jimmy Burke, detailed his role in the heist, his subsequent killing spree, his various criminal enterprises. He implicated dozens of other criminals, associates, soldiers, capos, anyone who'd been part of the world Henry was now betraying. And crucially, he agreed to testify. Agreeing to cooperate is one thing. Plenty of criminals tell the FBI things off the record, provide information in exchange for reduced sentences, but refuse to testify in open court. Because testifying means facing the people you're betraying, means looking them in the eye while you destroy their lives, means accepting that you'll be forever known as a rat. But Henry agreed to testify, understood that his cooperation was worthless unless he was willing to back it up in court, under oath, in front of juries and judges and the defense attorneys who try to tear apart his credibility. Paul Vario must have learned about Henry's cooperation almost immediately. The criminal underworld has sources in law enforcement. Always has. Corrupt cops and courthouse clerks and lawyers who pass information back to their mob contacts. Someone would have told Paul Vario that Henry Hill had flipped, that he was cooperating, that he was providing detailed testimony about decades of criminal activity. And Paul Vario must have felt something close to panic. Because Henry knew everything. Knew about the airport operations. Knew about the Lufthansa heist. Knew about murders and beatings and extortions. Knew about the legitimate businesses that fronted for illegal enterprises. Knew where bodies were buried, sometimes literally. Henry Hill's testimony could bring down the entire organization, could send Paul Vario back to prison for the rest of his life, could destroy everything he'd built over 6 decades of criminal activity. But it was too late to kill Henry. He was in federal custody, protected 24 hours a day, surrounded by agents who understood that keeping Henry Hill alive was essential to their cases. Even Paul Vario, with all his connections and resources, couldn't reach someone in witness protection. So Paul Vario could only watch as his empire crumbled, as his crew was dismantled through arrests and indictments, as the legal system he'd spent decades evading finally caught up with him. In 1984, Paul Vario was convicted of fraud. The specific charge related to helping Henry Hill get a no-show job, a fake position with a legitimate company that allowed Henry to claim employment and get paroled early from a previous sentence. It sounds minor compared to everything else Paul Vario had done. A paperwork crime, a technical violation, but it carried a 4-year federal sentence. For more years in prison at age 70. For more years away from the streets, from his operations, from whatever remained of his criminal empire. And Henry Hill testified at that trial, took the stand and explained in detail how Paul Vario had arranged the no-show job, how it was part of a pattern of fraud and corruption, how Paul Vario had manipulated the system to benefit himself and his associates. Paul Vario sat in court and listened to the kid he'd mentored destroy him. Listened to Henry recount crimes and conversations in details that only someone truly inside the organization would know. Listened to the prosecution build their case brick by brick using testimony from someone Paul Vario had trusted for decades. The betrayal must have been complete, must have felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Not because Paul Vario was capable of the kind of genuine emotion that normal people feel when betrayed, but because it represented failure. Represented a fundamental miscalculation about who to trust and how to maintain control. Paul Vario had spent his entire adult life cultivating fear and loyalty, making people understand that crossing him meant death, that cooperation with authorities was unforgivable, that the code of silence was absolute. And now someone he'd personally mentored, someone he'd protected and elevated and trusted, had violated that code in the most comprehensive way possible. He was convicted, sentenced to 4 years, sent to federal prison yet again at age 70. But his legal troubles weren't over. Not even close. On February 21st, 1985, while Paul Vario was serving his fraud sentence, he was indicted again. This time for racketeering conspiracy involving extortion. He and several co-conspirators were charged with extorting over $350,000 from air cargo companies at JFK Airport. The scheme was simple and effective. Pay us or face labor problems. Strikes, slowdowns, accidents, whatever it took to shut down operations and cost these companies millions in lost revenue. The cargo companies paid. They always paid. Because the alternative was watching their businesses suffer while Paul Vario and his associates collected money for doing nothing except threatening them. It was the airport operation that Paul Vario had spent decades building, the system of control and corruption that had made him rich. And now, thanks to Henry Hill's testimony and years of FBI investigation, it was being used to prosecute him under federal racketeering statutes. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, designed specifically to target organized crime by prosecuting patterns of criminal behavior rather than individual crimes. It allowed prosecutors to connect decades of seemingly unrelated crimes into one comprehensive case, to show juries not just that Paul Vario had committed specific acts, but that he'd run a criminal enterprise, that everything he did was part of an ongoing conspiracy to violate federal law. And Henry Hill testified again, provided details about how the extortion scheme worked, named names, explained the organizational structure, made it clear that Paul Vario wasn't just another criminal, but a boss who directed and benefited from systematic criminal activity. The trial was devastating for Paul Vario. His lawyers tried to attack Henry's credibility, pointed out that he was a convicted criminal, a drug dealer, someone who'd lied and cheated his entire life. Why should a jury believe him now? But prosecutors had corroborating evidence, financial records, surveillance footage, testimony from other witnesses who confirmed parts of Henry's story. They'd build a case that didn't rely solely on the word of an admitted criminal. They connected the dots in ways that made Paul Vario's guilt undeniable. He was convicted again, sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for extortion. 10 years on top of the 4 he was already serving. He was 71 years old. The math was simple and brutal. He'd be 81 when he finished this sentence. If he lived that long, if he survived more than a decade in federal prison with failing health and the stress of knowing that everything he'd built was gone. His empire had crumbled completely. His crew was destroyed. Some members dead from Burke's paranoia, others in prison on various charges, others cooperating with authorities to save themselves. The operations at the airport were shut down. The loan sharking and bookmaking rackets were dismantled. The protection schemes were prosecuted. Everything Paul Vario had spent 60 years building was gone. And it was all because of Henry Hill. Because one man, faced with the choice between loyalty and survival, chose survival. Because the code that Paul Vario had relied on to protect himself turned out to be less powerful than the human instinct to avoid dying in prison. Jimmy Burke was also convicted, though strangely not for anything related to the Lufthansa heist. The FBI never managed to build a prosecutable case connecting Burke to the robbery, despite knowing he'd planned and executed it. Instead, they got him for his involvement in the Boston College point-shaving scandal and for the murder of a drug dealer named Richard Eaton. Burke was sentenced to 12 years for the point-shaving scheme. Then, while serving that sentence, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to an additional 20 years to life. He'd die in prison in 1996 from lung cancer, never having been officially charged with the crime that defined his criminal career. But at least Burke avoided prosecution for Lufthansa. Paul Vario wasn't so lucky. While he also wasn't directly charged with the robbery, his conviction for extortion was built on testimony about his control of the airport, his approval of hijackings and robberies, his systematic criminal exploitation of JFK for decades. The Lufthansa heist hung over everything. The FBI knew he'd approved it. Henry Hill had testified about it. But proving it in court, connecting Paul Vario directly to that specific crime with evidence that would survive legal challenges, proved impossible. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses were dead. Too much evidence had been destroyed or never existed in the first place. But it didn't matter. Paul Vario was going to die in prison anyway. The fraud conviction and the extortion conviction together ensured that. 14 years total. At his age, with his health problems, it was effectively a life sentence. He was incarcerated at various federal facilities as his health deteriorated, transferred from prison to prison as authorities tried to manage his medical needs. And through it all, He maintained his silence, never cooperated, never testified against anyone, never tried to reduce his sentence by becoming an informant himself. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of what would happen if he violated the code he'd spent his life enforcing. Maybe it was simply understanding that cooperation wouldn't help him anyway, that prosecutors had everything they needed from Henry Hill and didn't need another elderly mobster's testimony. Or maybe, in some twisted way, Paul Vario respected the code even as it destroyed him. Even as Henry Hill's violation of that code sent him to prison for what would be the rest of his life, Paul Vario refused to do the same thing, refused to become what Henry had become. He was 71 years old, sitting in a federal prison cell, watching his health fail, knowing he'd never walk free again, knowing that everything he'd built was gone, knowing that his name would be remembered only because of the crimes he'd committed and the movie that sanitized them into entertainment. The empire he'd spent 60 years building had crumbled in less than 4 years. From the Lufthansa Heist in December 1978 to his final conviction in 1985. For years during which everything fell apart. For years of betrayals and testimony and convictions that erased 6 decades of criminal success. And Paul Vario, who'd survived poverty and juvenile detention and rape convictions and multiple prison sentences and decades of criminal violence, couldn't survive one associate deciding that cooperation was better than loyalty. Couldn't survive Henry Hill choosing to live. That was his legacy. Not the power he'd wielded or the money he'd made or the territory he'd controlled. His legacy was being brought down by someone he trusted, being destroyed by his own success in mentoring a criminal who turned out to be smart enough to save himself. Chapter 11. The Final Reckoning. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when he realizes his entire life has been a waste. Paul Vario sat in a cell at Fort Worth Federal Prison in Texas, 71 years old and dying slowly. The man who'd once controlled East New York, who'd commanded crews of violent criminals, who'd made millions from decades of organized crime, was now reduced to an inmate number in a facility 1,600 miles from Brooklyn. The fraud conviction had put him away for 4 years. He could have survived that. For years was manageable. He'd done longer stretches before. But then came February 21st, 1985, and everything changed. The racketeering indictment was comprehensive, devastating in its detail and scope. Federal prosecutors had built a case that connected decades of criminal activity at JFK Airport into one massive conspiracy. And at the center of that conspiracy was Paul Vario, the man who'd controlled airport operations through violence, intimidation, and corruption. The charges were specific: extorting over $350,000 from air cargo companies, threatening labor strikes and violence if companies didn't pay tribute, creating a system where legitimate businesses had to fund organized crime just to operate at the airport. But the real damage came from what the charges represented. This wasn't just about one extortion scheme. This was about Paul Vario's entire criminal empire, his decades of control, his systematic exploitation of the airport that had made him rich and powerful. Prosecutors were using RICO statutes to prosecute not just individual crimes, but an entire pattern of criminal behavior. And Henry Hill testified, again, took the stand, and explained in methodical detail how Paul Vario's operation worked, how companies were identified and targeted, how threats were delivered, how payments were collected, how the money flowed up through the organization to Paul Vario himself. Henry described specific incidents, named specific victims, provided dates and locations and details that only someone deeply embedded in the operation could know. He explained the organizational structure, the hierarchy, the way decisions were made and orders were carried out. The defense tried everything, attacked Henry's credibility, pointed out his drug use, his criminal history, his motivation to lie in exchange for a reduced sentence and witness protection. But prosecutors had corroborating evidence. They had financial records showing unexplained income to air cargo companies. They had testimony from company executives who confirmed they'd paid money to avoid labor problems. They had surveillance footage and wiretap recordings that supported Henry's version of events. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. They heard enough, seen enough. The evidence was overwhelming. Paul Vario was guilty. Guilty of running a criminal enterprise. Guilty of extortion. Guilty of racketeering. Guilty of violating federal law in ways that had enriched him and terrorized legitimate businesses for decades. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison. 10 years on top of the 4 he was already serving for the fraud conviction. 14 years total. At age 71, it was a death sentence. Paul Vario would be 85 years old if he survived to complete his sentence. And nobody who knew him, who understood his health problems and the toll that decades of criminal life had taken on his body, believed he'd make it that long. He was transferred to Fort Worth Federal Prison in Texas. Far from New York. Far from Brooklyn. Far from everything and everyone he'd known. The Bureau of Prisons does that sometimes. Sends high-profile inmates to facilities far from their home territories to prevent them from maintaining control of their criminal organizations from behind bars. Not that Paul Vario had much of an organization left to control. His crew was destroyed. The ones who weren't dead were in prison or cooperating with authorities. The operations he'd spent decades building were shut down. The territory he controlled was being divided up among other criminals. The empire was gone, and his health was failing. Years of stress and violence and incarceration had taken their toll. He'd been a physically imposing man in his prime. 6 feet 3 inches tall, heavy, intimidating. Now he was 71 and shrinking, his body betraying him the way everything else in his life had betrayed him. He developed respiratory problems. Serious ones. His lungs were failing, struggling to pull in enough oxygen to keep him alive. He'd been a smoker for decades, like most men of his generation, and now he was paying the price. Every breath was labor. Every day was a struggle. Prison medical care is notoriously inadequate. It's not designed to provide compassionate end-of-life treatment. It's designed to keep inmates alive long enough to serve their sentences while spending as little money as possible. Paul Vario received treatment, but it wasn't enough. His condition continued to deteriorate. The diagnosis was lung cancer, the disease that kills smokers slowly and painfully, that robs you of the ability to breathe, that reduces you to gasping and wheezing and fighting for every breath. Paul Vario, who'd spent his life inflicting pain on others, was now experiencing his own prolonged agony. He faced it alone. His wife Phyllis, the woman he'd adored so obsessively that he'd sent his entire crew to hospitalize a restaurant staff for spilling wine on her, was in New York. Visiting federal inmates in Texas is expensive and difficult. The prison system doesn't make it easy for families. They'd see each other occasionally when she could make the trip, but mostly Paul Vario was alone with his illness and his memories. What do you think about when you're dying in a prison cell? When you're 73 years old and suffocating slowly from lung cancer, and you know you'll never see freedom again? Do you feel regret? Do you wish you'd made different choices, lived a different life, found some path that didn't end with you dying in a cell 1,600 miles from home? Or do you just feel angry? Angry at Henry Hill for talking. Angry at Jimmy Burke for being too paranoid. Angry at the FBI for never giving up. Angry at a justice system that finally, after decades of trying, managed to put you away forever. Paul Vario never spoke publicly about what he felt during those final years in prison. Never gave interviews. Never wrote a memoir. Never tried to justify or explain or contextualize his life of crime. He maintained the silence he'd always maintained, the code he'd lived by even as it destroyed him. But the records show the facts. Show a man dying slowly in federal custody. Show transfer requests denied. Show medical treatments provided, but ultimately insufficient. Show an empire that had crumbled completely, leaving nothing behind except testimony and indictments, and the scattered remnants of a criminal organization that once controlled significant territory in New York. His family tried to get him compassionate release. It's a provision in federal law that allows terminally ill inmates to be released to die at home rather than in prison. But compassionate release requires approval from prison officials and the judge who sentenced you. And there was no compassion coming for Paul Vario. He was a mob boss, a violent criminal, someone who'd terrorized people for decades. Someone who'd built an empire on fear and extortion and violence. The fact that he was dying didn't erase those crimes, didn't make him sympathetic, didn't create any obligation to let him die in comfort rather than in a prison medical facility. So he stayed, remained incarcerated as his condition worsened, as the cancer spread through his lungs, as breathing became more difficult, as death approached with the slow inevitability of a train coming down the tracks. He had visitors occasionally, family members who made the journey, maybe a few old associates who hadn't been arrested or killed or cooperated with authorities. But mostly he was alone, isolated by geography and circumstance and the choices he'd made over 7 decades. The Bureau of Prisons keeps detailed medical records. They documented Paul Vario's decline, documented the treatments attempted, documented the steady deterioration of his respiratory function, documented his weight loss and weakness and the various complications that come with terminal lung cancer. He spent time in the prison medical facility, a place that's neither a real hospital nor a real prison, but some grim combination of both, where seriously ill inmates are monitored and treated to the extent that limited resources allow, where people go to die when society has decided they don't deserve dignity or comfort in their final days. Did Paul Vario think about the people he'd hurt, the truck drivers he'd terrorized, the business owners he'd extorted, the gamblers he'd destroyed through predatory lending, the families of the people he'd ordered killed? Did any of that matter to him as he lay dying? Probably not. Men like Paul Vario don't build successful criminal careers by being plagued with conscience. Don't rise to positions of power by feeling empathy for their victims. The capacity to hurt people without remorse, to see other human beings as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated, that's not something that changes just because you're dying. But he must have thought about Henry Hill, must have spent hours replaying their relationship, remembering the young kid who used to run errands, the associate who'd been part of countless scores, the protege he'd mentored and protected and trusted, and then the informant who destroyed everything with his testimony. That betrayal must have burned, must have been almost as painful as the cancer consuming his lungs, because Paul Vario had believed in the code, had lived his entire life according to rules about loyalty and silence. And Henry Hill had proven that those rules meant nothing when faced with 20 years in federal prison and the threat of assassination. The code was a lie. Always had been. It worked when everyone benefited from maintaining it. But the moment someone's self-interest dictated cooperation instead of silence, the code evaporated like morning fog. And Paul Vario, who'd enforced that code through violence and fear for decades, was now its victim. He also must have thought about the Lufthansa Heist, the score that should have been his crowning achievement. $5.8 million. The biggest cash robbery in American history at that time. A heist so successful, so perfectly executed, that it became legendary. But instead of cementing his legacy as a criminal mastermind, the Lufthansa Heist had triggered the chain of events that destroyed him. The paranoia and killing spree that followed. Henry Hill's drug arrest. The cooperation and testimony. The indictments and convictions. Everything that led to him dying in a Texas prison. If he'd never approved that heist, if he'd found some other way to solve his financial problems after losing the cocaine shipment, would things have been different? Would his empire have survived? Would he be dying in his own bed in Brooklyn instead of in a prison medical facility? Impossible to know. Maybe the FBI would have gotten him eventually anyway. They've been trying for decades. They had the resources and the patience and the institutional commitment to bring down organized crime figures. Maybe Henry Hill would have cooperated over something else. Maybe some other associate would have flipped. Or maybe Paul Vario would have retired wealthy and died peacefully surrounded by family. Maybe the Lufthansa heist really was the decision that sealed his fate. The one choice that proved to be one choice too many. By early 1988, Paul Vario was clearly dying. The cancer had progressed beyond any possibility of treatment. He was on oxygen, struggling to breathe, even with mechanical assistance. His body was shutting down system by system as the disease consumed him. Prison officials documented everything, filed reports about his condition, noted the progression of his illness, prepared for the inevitable. When high-profile inmates die in custody, there are procedures, notifications that have to be made, paperwork that has to be filed, arrangements for body transport and burial. Paul Vario's family was notified that the end was near, that they should prepare themselves, that if they wanted to say goodbye, they needed to come soon because time was running out. He was 73 years old, had lived longer than many men in his profession, longer than Tommy DeSimone, who'd been killed at 28, longer than the various Lufthansa crew members who'd been murdered in their 30s and 40s, longer than many mobsters who died young for violence or overdoses or prison. But he was dying in a cage, away from home, away from everything that had mattered to him. A man who'd spent his life seeking power and control was now powerless and controlled. His body was failing. His empire was gone. His legacy was reduced to testimony in court documents and a sanitized portrayal in a movie that most people would remember instead of the truth. The respiratory failure was progressing. His lungs could no longer provide enough oxygen. His body was starving for air. Each breath was harder than the last. The medical staff did what they could, but there's no cure for terminal lung cancer. There's only management of symptoms until the inevitable end. Paul Vario was conscious through most of it, aware that he was dying, watching his own body fail, experiencing the terror that comes with suffocation, with feeling your lungs refuse to work, with your brain screaming for oxygen that isn't coming. It's a horrible way to die, drowning slowly in air, fighting for every breath, feeling your body shut down piece by piece. And for a man who'd spent his life inflicting suffering on others, there's a certain grim justice in dying this way. But justice or not, it was the end. The final chapter of a life that had spanned 7 decades of crime. From the juvenile detention center at age 11 to the federal prison cell at age 73. From running errands for gangsters in South Brooklyn to commanding his own crew and controlling territory worth millions. From poverty to power and back to powerlessness. On May 3rd, 1988, at 73 years old, Paul Vario died. The official cause of death was respiratory failure as a result of lung cancer. But really, he died from the accumulated weight of 7 decades of choices. Choices to hurt people. Choices to steal and extort and murder. Choices that had made him rich and powerful and feared. And ultimately, choices that killed him. His body was transported back to New York. Back to Brooklyn. Back to the neighborhoods where he'd built his empire. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. A cemetery full of mobsters and criminals, where organized crime figures are laid to rest near each other, even in death. There was a funeral, family and friends, and whatever remained of his organization. People who remembered Paul Vario. People who'd benefited from his protection or suffered from his violence. People who came to pay respects or simply to confirm that he was really dead. But the empire he'd built was already forgotten, already being carved up and redistributed, already fading into history except for the court records and FBI files and the testimony that had brought him down. Paul Vario was gone, and Brooklyn barely noticed. Chapter 12. Death of a Gangster. The grave marker at St. John's Cemetery is simple. Too simple for a man who controlled an empire. Paul Vario. Born July 9, 1914. Died May 3, 1988. 73 years condensed into 2 dates and a slab of stone. No mention of his crimes. No acknowledgement of the lives he'd destroyed. No epitaph explaining who he was or what he'd done. Just a name and dates in a cemetery full of mobsters who'd also believed they were untouchable. His funeral was attended by family, by a few remaining associates who hadn't been arrested or killed or cooperated with authorities, by people who'd known him in life and felt obligated to see him into death. But it wasn't the grand affair you might expect for someone who'd once wielded so much power. The empire was gone. The organization was dismantled. And Paul Vario was being buried as what he'd always really been beneath the facade, a violent criminal who died in prison. The mob doesn't do elaborate funerals for guys who die behind bars. There's no honor in that, no glory. You're supposed to die on your feet, not in a prison medical facility, gasping for air. You're supposed to go out in a blaze of violence, or at least peacefully in your own bed, surrounded by wealth and family. Dying from lung cancer in a Texas federal prison doesn't earn you respect. It earns you a hole in the ground, and people moving on quickly. Jimmy Burke was still alive then, still in prison, serving his own sentences. He'd die 8 years later from the same disease, lung cancer, claiming another mobster who'd smoked his way through decades of criminal activity. But in 1988, Burke was still breathing, still incarcerated, probably not mourning the death of his former boss. Henry Hill was alive too, living somewhere under witness protection with his family, using whatever name the FBI had given him, trying to build some kind of normal life far from New York, far from the mob, far from everyone who'd want him dead for testifying. He destroyed Paul Vario with his testimony, and now Paul Vario was dead, and Henry was free. Free in the sense that he wasn't in prison, but trapped in the sense that he'd always have to look over his shoulder, always have to wonder if someone had found him, always have to live with what he'd done. The newspapers covered Paul Vario's death briefly. A few paragraphs noting that a reputed mob captain had died in federal custody, mentioning his convictions for fraud and extortion, referencing his connection to the Lucchese crime family. But nothing in depth, nothing exploring who he really was or what his life had meant. Just the basic facts, and then moving on to other news. Because by 1988, Paul Vario was already forgotten. The mob was changing. New generations of criminals were taking over. The old ways, the old rules, the old territories were being redistributed and reorganized. Paul Vario's death closed a chapter that had already ended years earlier, when Henry Hill started cooperating. But his story wasn't quite finished. Because 2 years later, in 1990, Martin Scorsese released Goodfellas. And suddenly Paul Vario was resurrected. Not as himself, as Paulie Cicero, as a character played by Paul Sorvino, as a fictionalized version scrubbed clean of the worst aspects of his real life. The movie was brilliant, a masterpiece of filmmaking. Paul Sorvino's performance was nuanced and memorable. He created a character who was wise, cautious, fatherly, someone who gave advice and hosted family dinners and tried to keep his crew from making stupid mistakes. Someone who operated with a code of honor, who had principles, who represented a romanticized version of organized crime. And that character became how millions of people understood Paul Vario. Not the rapist who spent 25 years in and out of prison. Not the violent psychopath who sent his crew to hospitalize restaurant staff over spilled wine. Not the mob boss federal prosecutors called one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in New York City. But Paulie Cicero, the calm, collected father figure from the movie. It was a complete fiction, a sanitized version designed to make audiences comfortable with a character they could root for. You can't make a mainstream Hollywood movie about a child rapist and expect audiences to engage with it emotionally. You can't ask people to spend 2.5 hours with someone whose real story is too dark, too violent, too morally reprehensible. So Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi made choices. They started Paul Vario's story after his release from prison in 1962. Skipped right over the rape conviction. Skipped the parole violations. Skipped the 25 years in the criminal justice system that should have defined who he was. They minimized his violence. Showed him as someone who approved violence rather than someone who participated in it. Kept him at a distance from the worst crimes. Made him a boss who gave orders rather than someone who beat people with his own hands. They gave him dignity. Made him smart and strategic. Showed him warning Henry Hill about the dangers of drug dealing. Portrayed him as someone trying to maintain order in a chaotic world. As someone who actually cared about the people in his crew rather than seeing them as disposable assets. It was good storytelling. It made for compelling cinema, but wasn't true. The real Paul Vario was so much worse than Paulie Cicero. So much more violent. So much more willing to hurt people for reasons that had nothing to do with business or strategy. So much more psychologically damaged and morally bankrupt. And that 16-year-old girl from Howard Beach in 1937, she's completely erased from the narrative. Her trauma doesn't exist in the Goodfellas universe. The rape that defined Paul Vario's early adulthood, that showed exactly what kind of person he was, that sent him to prison for what should have been the most important formative decade of his life. It's just gone. Disappeared. Deemed too inconvenient for the story Hollywood wanted to tell. That's the most disturbing part of Paul Vario's legacy. Not that he committed horrible crimes. Lots of criminals do that. But that his crimes were successfully sanitized and repackaged as entertainment. That millions of people know Paulie Cicero, but have no idea who Paul Vario really was. That the movie created a mythology that has completely overshadowed the reality. Film critics praise Goodfellas as an unflinching look at organized crime, as a movie that shows the reality behind the glamour, as something that demystifies the mob and shows the violence and paranoia and ultimate emptiness of that lifestyle. And in many ways, they're right. The movie does show violence. Does show Henry Hill's life falling apart. Does show that crime doesn't pay in the end. But it also fundamentally lies about Paul Vario. Presents him as someone worthy of respect rather than someone whose life was a catalog of violence and cruelty. And that lie has been incredibly successful. Ask most people what they know about the real person behind Paulie Cicero, and they'll have no idea. They'll remember Paul Sorvino's performance. Remember the family dinners and the calm advice and the father figure who tried to steer Henry Hill right. They won't know about the rape conviction. Won't know about his hair-trigger temper. Won't know that federal prosecutors specifically called him one of the most violent criminals they'd ever prosecuted. Won't know that his own son died under mysterious circumstances, and that Paul Vario's response was to have mourners beat journalists at the funeral. That's Hollywood's power. To take a monster and make him sympathetic. To take someone whose real story is too dark for mainstream consumption and create a version that audiences can engage with. To prioritize entertainment over truth. And Paul Vario benefits from that sanitization, even in death. His grave marker doesn't mention his crimes, and popular culture has created a version of him that's almost heroic. The wise mob boss, the strategic thinker, the man with a code of honor, even if that code existed outside the law. But the truth matters. The real Paul Vario matters. Not because he deserves to be remembered fondly. He doesn't. But because the victims deserve to be remembered. The 16-year-old girl he raped. The truck drivers he terrorized. The business owners he extorted. The people who borrowed money from him and then spent years being brutalized by his collection crews. Those people existed. Their suffering was real. And it gets erased when we allow Hollywood to create comfortable fictions about the criminals who hurt them. When we let entertainment trump truth. When we decide that a compelling performance is more important than historical accuracy. Paul Vario died alone in a prison cell 1,600 miles from home. Died gasping for air. Died knowing that everything he'd built was gone. Died understanding that his protege had betrayed him, and that betrayal had destroyed his entire organization. Died with lung cancer eating away at his body, punishment for decades of smoking, a slow and agonizing death. There's no redemption in that story. No moment where he sees the error of his ways and changes. No deathbed confession or attempt to make amends. Just a violent criminal dying the way many violent criminals die. In pain. In prison. Unmourned except by the handful of people who'd benefited from his crimes. His legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was undeniably successful for most of his criminal career. Built a real empire. Controlled significant territory. Made millions of dollars. Commanded respect through fear. Operated for decades before law enforcement finally brought him down. By the standards of organized crime, he was successful. But he also ended up exactly where society wanted him. In prison. Convicted. His empire destroyed. His crew dismantled. His criminal enterprise prosecuted and eliminated. The system he'd spent his life evading eventually caught up with him. Eventually made him pay for at least some of what he'd done. And he died knowing that. Died understanding that all his violence and cunning and strategic thinking hadn't been enough. That one associate deciding to cooperate had unraveled everything. That the code he'd lived by was a fiction that dissolved the moment someone's self-interest dictated cooperation over loyalty. That must have been the most bitter part. Not the dying itself. Everyone dies. But dying knowing that you failed. that your life's work was destroyed, that you'd be remembered not for what you accomplished, but for being brought down by someone you trusted. Martin Scorsese probably never intended to honor Paul Vario. Goodfellas is ultimately a story about the emptiness and futility of organized crime. Henry Hill ends the movie in witness protection, living in a bland suburb, mourning the loss of the life he'd known. It's meant to be tragic, meant to show that crime really doesn't pay. But in creating Paulie Cicero, in giving Paul Vario's fictionalized counterpart dignity and wisdom and a certain nobility, Scorsese and Pileggi created something unintentionally disturbing. They created a character people admire, people quote, people reference as an example of how a boss should operate. And that character bears almost no resemblance to the real Paul Vario. The rapist, the violent psychopath, the extortionist, the man who approved murders and beatings and terrorized people for decades. The criminal who died alone in prison with lung cancer, eating away at his body. The real Paul Vario deserves to be remembered, not celebrated, not romanticized, but remembered accurately, as a cautionary tale about what happens when violence and ambition combine with intelligence, as an example of how organized crime really operates, not through noble codes and family values, but through fear and brutality and the systematic exploitation of anyone vulnerable enough to be exploited. His grave in St. John's Cemetery is visited occasionally, mostly by true crime enthusiasts and Goodfellas fans who want to see where the real Paulie is buried. They take pictures, share them online, treat it like a tourist attraction, another stop on the New York mob history tour. But they're not really visiting Paul Vario's grave. They're visiting Paulie Cicero's grave, paying respects to a fictional character, honoring a version of a man that never existed. And the real Paul Vario, the violent criminal who raped a child and spent his life hurting people, remains buried in more ways than one. That's perhaps the greatest injustice. Not that Paul Vario died in prison. He deserved that. Not that his empire was destroyed. That was justice. But that his story was rewritten. That his victims were erased. That Hollywood took one of the most violent criminals in New York City history and turned him into a character people admire. The 16-year-old girl from Howard Beach deserves better. The people he terrorized deserve better. The victims of his decades of crime deserve better than to be forgotten while their victimizer is transformed into entertainment. Paul Vario is dead, has been dead for over 35 years. His empire is gone. His organization is dismantled. The Lucchese crime family continues, but without any trace of his influence. The airport operations he controlled are long since shut down. The territories he commanded have been redistributed dozens of times. He's gone, but the lie about who he was persists. Lives on through a movie that's shown to new generations, through a performance that's studied in acting classes, through a character that's become iconic in American cinema. Paulie Cicero is immortal. Paul Vario is forgotten. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe the man who spent his life hiding behind fronts and shell companies and layers of insulation would appreciate being hidden behind a fictional character, even in death. Maybe he'd enjoy knowing that millions of people think they know his story, but actually have no idea who he really was. Or maybe, if there's any justice in the universe, he's somewhere understanding that his real legacy is this: a grave in Queens, a series of court documents detailing his crimes, FBI files cataloging his violence, and a truth that keeps getting buried beneath comfortable fictions. Paul Vario died on May 3rd, 1988, 73 years old. Lung cancer. Fort Worth Federal Prison. The end of a life that spanned poverty, violence, power, and ultimate defeat. The end of a criminal career that destroyed lives and enriched only himself. The end of an empire built on fear that crumbled the moment fear was no longer enough to keep people silent. He's buried in St. John's Cemetery. His grave is there. You can visit it if you want. Can stand over the spot where one of New York's most violent criminals is buried. Can think about the life he lived and the choices he made and the people he hurt. But you won't learn the truth from that grave marker. Won't understand who he really was from those 2 dates. For that, you need court records, FBI files, testimony from people who knew him. The documented reality behind the Hollywood fiction. This is that reality. This is Paul Vario. Not Paulie Cicero. Not the wise father figure. Not the strategic thinker with a code of honor. But a rapist who spent 25 years in prison. A violent psychopath federal prosecutors called one of the most dangerous criminals in New York. A mob boss who approved murders and extortion and built an empire on suffering. That's the truth. That's the man. That's the story Goodfellas didn't show you. And now you know. Now you understand what Hollywood erased in the name of entertainment. Now you can see the real Paul Vario beneath the fiction. The scenes Goodfellas didn't show you weren't omitted by accident. They were too dark, too real, too honest about what organized crime actually is when you strip away the mythology and the romanticism and the comfortable lies. Paul Vario's story is over. Has been over since 1988. But the truth about who he was, what he did, and what his life really meant continues to matter. Because truth always matters. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's dark. Even when it ruins the comfortable fiction that most people prefer. This was Paul Vario. This is his real legacy. Remember it.